Chapter 108. It was just like how White couldn't summon a monster back after it went berserk. If a magus wanted to summon a familiar or a magic fairy back into the card, he needed to get a response from the familiar or the magic fairy. Once the familiar or the magic fairy was in a state where it couldn't respond, then he could only forcefully summon it back. And the prerequisite for forcefully summoning it back was that the magus magic power was higher than the magic fairy's. Dake desperately injected magic power into the branch card, but the signal couldn't be transmitted to the female demon beast. This made him feel very bad. The scene in front of him was too familiar. Generally, this situation was the beginning of depravity, parasitism, or even possession. Especially the moonlight was getting stronger and stronger, gradually converging to a point. It felt like the ritual had finally reached its end. First website. https://m. VIP can't you? VIP everything seemed to be settled. It didn't give Dake too much time to think. The melody formed by the Marine Order's prayers suddenly became high-pitched. The black lumps were also violently rolling like boiling water. Then, the last trace of the converged moonlight was absorbed cleanly. The black block suddenly stopped rolling. The world seemed to stand still at this moment. Only the melody became more and more high-pitched. Outside the castle, the night sky returned to its clarity. The moonlight was no longer converged. Everything seemed to have come to a moment when nothing had happened. However, the black block in the temple began to flow from top to bottom. The dark and dirty substance flowed to the ground and spread out like a pool of sewage. A trace of white light flowed out from the initial gap and then bloomed. It was an extremely soft light that made people feel like they were bathed in the spring breeze. When this light shone on the body, there was an extremely comfortable feeling rising from the bottom of the heart, a heartfelt joy. The holy archangel with 8 pairs of snow-white wings was reborn from the dark sludge. Little demon beast? Dake called out tentatively. But the fairy beast only raised her head slightly, the corners of her mouth curled up, and said, "I am the goddess of the moon, and also the mother of the earth." Dake was silent for a while, then burst out a few words. "No, you are just a fairy beast." The fairy beast, no, the moon goddess, did not show any signs of anger. Instead, she chuckled and said, "Appearances are but nothingness. The divinity of my root has already awakened." As she spoke, she stretched out her hand, and a ray of moonlight shot down. She pinched it in her hand and formed a moon god's arrow. That was the manifestation of the power of the moon. She reached out again, and a sacred bow appeared in her left hand. Blasphemers will be punished. The moon goddess knocked the moon god's arrow in her right hand onto her holy bow. She elegantly drew the bow and slowly aimed at Dake, who was standing at the entrance of the temple. The light released by the moon god's arrow suddenly became intense. Then the bow was pulled to a full moon and shot out. Swish! The arrow hit its target. The shield rose. Dake summoned Kettle in time to protect his chest. However, Huahua, who had withstood a casual arrow from the moon goddess, had countless cracks on its tough shell. Magic power, 901 sturdy, passive skill. The magic elf with this skill will not be killed in one hit. Huahua, who had dodged the attack by relying on its passive skill, suddenly became dispirited. Dake hurriedly scooped it up and slid outside the temple. No matter how sturdy Huahua was, it was only a 3-star card that could be summoned normally. The moon goddess only needed to be slightly more serious to easily penetrate its defense. Magic summoning. At this critical moment, Dake broke through the limit again, and the summoning time was reduced to 4 seconds. Huahua, who had taken the energy potion, finally regained some energy. Without Dake's command, it immediately used its superpower and used equal distribution of power in an attempt to weaken the power of the moon goddess. However, the superpower released by Huahua was easily broken by the moon goddess. The first failure of equal distribution of power made Dake realize that he was in a desperate situation. He touched his card bag, and his face was pale. Huahua could be said to be his biggest reliance. Next was Moon Ivan in Bliss 3 state and the Silence Potion. However, the Silence Potion, which interfered with the effects of the potion, could not play a decisive role at this moment. Although Moon Ivan was strong, it was impossible for him to fight against the moon goddess who had devoured the demoness beast. However, the moon goddess had already knocked her next moon god arrow. Dake did not have time to think. He waved his hand and summoned the silence potion, and threw it at the moon goddess. The moon god arrow left the bowstring and shot through the potion bottle. The silence potion suddenly exploded, forming a cloud of mist. Dake immediately rushed out with Huahua. The moment the cooldown ended, he summoned Illusory Beast, Ivan and Bliss 3. Seeing the evolved moon, Ivan's eyes lit up, and he pounced forward without a care for the situation. Dake had a flash of inspiration at this crucial moment, and immediately added another, Pride Eye. As the dark golden ball of light entered between his eyebrows, Moon Ivan's frivolous eyes suddenly had a hint of arrogance. This made him a little more reserved, and his pouncing action came to an abrupt halt, but his eyes were still provocative. There was a feeling of wanting to resist, but also wanting to meet. It actually worked. Dake's mind spun quickly. When he used Bliss 3 just now, he did not form a connection with the moon goddess. This meant that the moon goddess, who was no longer a statue, could control her own energy, and his previous tactic was completely ineffective. The moon goddess followed closely, and the moon god arrow once again took aim. Whoosh! The arrow of light flew over. Moon Ivan, who felt the danger, turned around and threw out a shadow ball. However, before the shadow ball could even touch the moon god arrow, it was purified by the holy light. Bang! Moon Ivan let out a miserable cry, and was sent flying by the shockwave from the moon god arrow. Dake took the opportunity to hide in a corner, and gasped for breath. The level difference is too big. Shouldn't this be the time for the hero to appear? Where's the hero? Dake's thoughts were already a bit chaotic. However, he was still trying to think. Suddenly, a thought appeared in his mind. Wait, the hero. Isn't he in my bag? The moon goddess flapped her wings as she chased after him, as if she was enjoying her first joy after being reborn. She was very satisfied with the skin of the fairy beast. Originally, the skin of the witch beast was also very much to her liking, but as expected, a goddess should be holy. Moreover, this skin seemed to hide a huge amount of potential. If she could dig out that potential, she instinctively felt that she would definitely be able to regain her past glory. Yes, at least 10 to 20%. Found him. Seeing the figure in front of her move, the moon goddess was delighted, and once again condensed a moon god arrow. However, what appeared in front of her was a glowing stag. Chapter 109. Shine Light of the Soul. The moment the voice sounded, the moon goddess subconsciously loosened her grip on the arrow, and the moon god's arrow shot out. The stag that belonged to the hero's son had already raised its head, and the white light released from between its horns was abnormally strong. Ultimate skill, Light of the Soul. The moon god's arrow was swallowed by the white light in the blink of an eye, but the two were not separated at all. The arrow passed through the white light and pierced through the stag's head. The stag was instantly killed, but the light of the soul was completely released and shone on the moon goddess body without being affected at all. The moon goddess suddenly let out a miserable cry. Remember the website, VIP, can't you? Dake stood in the corner with his back against the wall. He tightly held the fantasy beast, stag, card in his hand and continuously poured magic power into it. As a fantasy beast personally made by the hero's son, the power hidden in this magic guide essence card was something that even the hero's son himself could not see through. But when Dake learned that his fantasy beast was a stag, he already felt that it was special. After all, in the original Harry Potter novel, the main character's guardian was a glowing stag. Moreover, this stag's ultimate skill was called Light of the Soul. The ultimate skill of a magic guide elf was never randomly named. Since it was called Light of the Soul, it must be a manifestation of the power of the soul. And speaking of the power of the soul, he had no choice but to mention Spirit Magus Red and Red's spirit summoning. Dake happened to read Red's soul summoning lecture, the difference between magic guide elf summoning and other magic guide summoning, and knew a thing or two about soul summoning. The foundation of soul summoning was the so-called bond. That was the connection between a magus and a magic guide elf. The accumulation of knowledge finally had an effect. Dake had the mentality of surviving in this desperate situation. Using the light of the soul as a medium, He finally reconstructed the connection between him and the little demon beast. Even though Dark had always treated the little magical beasts as experimental subjects, the unreserved trust they had accumulated day after day had led to an extremely deep relationship. Through the mental connection, he saw the little devil beast sleeping inside the goddess of Moon's body in the form of a demoness. Dake tried to wake her up. "It's 6 o'clock. It was a very calm sentence. However, the little devil beast suddenly quivered and opened its eyes. "It's 6 o'clock. It's time to go to the canteen to get breakfast and newspapers for Master." Afterward, the moon goddess screamed in agony. "Little demon beast. To be more precise, I should temporarily call her demoness beast." After awakening, the demoness beast immediately began to fight with the moon goddess for control of her body. The consciousness of the two sides clashed fiercely in the spiritual world. With the support of Dake's spiritual strength, no matter how one looked at it, it was impossible for the demoness to lose to the moon goddess, who was revived from a wisp of remnant consciousness. As the battle gradually intensified, in reality, the skin of the fairy beast began to distort and swell. 8 pairs of snow-white wings gradually turned black, and her hands and feet began to fight left and right. The skin of the fairy beast cracked inch by inch. Black lumps drilled out of the cracks in the skin and crawled back onto the surface of the fairy beast, like worms. The moon goddess's bearing was completely gone. She hugged her head and slowly curled up. In the blink of an eye, her entire body was buried in the black lumps again. Dake closed his eyes tightly and continued to maintain the mental connection with the demoness beast. Smack! The demoness beast's right hand slapped the moon goddess's white and tender cheek. Smack! The moon goddess responded in anger. In the spiritual world, the demoness beast and the moon goddess went from swearing at each other in the beginning to punching and slapping each other. Both sides were so tired that they were panting. When the demoness beast saw that the moon goddess's body was beginning to collapse, she immediately became spirited and laughed wildly. "My noble body is not something a lowly slave like you can invade?" The moon goddess's eyes were bloodshot. "Mere demon, the demoness beast. It's the noble female demon beast lord." The moon goddess. "Fight me one-on-one if you have the guts." The demoness beast. "I have a man. Why shouldn't I use it?" The moon goddess. "Damn it. Unlike the intense battle in the spiritual world, the secret passage fell into an eerie silence. A moment later, a little fairy with butterfly wings passed through the wall from above. Professor Didi silently appeared in front of Dake and floated half a meter in front of him. However, Dake, who had his eyes closed, did not notice at all. Professor Didi looked at him strangely for a long time before flapping his wings and flying in front of the moon goddess. Looking at the wriggling mountain-like lump, Professor Didi felt an unusual headache. She could not imagine how things had developed to this point. Could such a useless goddess really fulfill her long-cherished wish? But now that things had developed to this point, it was impossible to stop. Professor Didi raised her hand. From her fingers to her elbow, her slender pale fingers were gradually covered with a layer of fine silver. Then she spread open her fingers and stabbed them into the black block. In the spiritual world, the moon goddess's expression suddenly froze. Slap! The demoness beast slapped her face again, but the moon goddess was like a puppet in a cage and did not respond. The demoness beast was stunned because of this. The moon goddess abruptly turned into a pool of black mud from head to toe. The spiritual world, which had lost one of its supports, collapsed instantly. Dake suddenly opened his eyes. His fingers that were holding the magical beast, Stag, were already pale and weak. He did not have time to think and immediately ran out of the corner. His eyes swept across and fell on the spot where the moon goddess used to be. But he just happened to see the black lump collapse as if it had lost its vitality and flowed to the ground like mud. As the black lump completely collapsed, what appeared was a humanoid digital beast hugging its knees and curling up into a ball. The demoness beast slowly opened her eyes. As the world in her eyes gradually became clear, a familiar and warm figure gradually took shape. "Little demon beast? It's the demoness beast." She stood up shakily and pounced on the blonde youth, who could not let go no matter what. A snow-white feather floated down with her movement, slowly sinking into the mud. Chapter 110. The night after midnight had just begun. The students, who had no idea what happened in the secret passage of the castle, all went to the first floor when the bell rang. Anna took Luoxi's hand and sneakily looked for the prince in the dark. Ai Ma was holding a book in her left hand and playing with the gold coin with wings in her right hand. No one knew what she was thinking. In the temple, the girl with short black hair wearing a vampire countess suit finally woke up from her coma. No one noticed. In a dark corner, a bat that was supposed to disappear the moment the clock struck 12 was still quietly lurking. The little fairy with butterfly wings on her back returned to the top of the spiral clock tower. Professor Didi Makeseaway picked up a glowing bead with her thumb and forefinger, raised her head and carefully observed it under the moonlight. The bead was round and flawless, and a moon floated on it, competing with the bright moon in the night sky. Remember, https://m vipcanchu. VIP, this is the tear of the moon goddess? A voice sounded from behind. Professor Didi was not surprised. She said in a very calm tone, "The wheel of history has crushed too many things, and we can always find references from it. 4 eras ago, the legendary alchemist Martin offered a kingdom with a total population of 576,481 as a sacrifice in order to create a tear of the moon goddess. Finally, he got a response from the ruler of the moon, and I only borrowed 16 believers and 7 sacrifices to complete this experiment." Professor Kazair showed up inside. "So it's over?" "It's over, temporarily," Professor Didi said leisurely. "Are you here to stop me?" "No. I'm here to see you for the last time." Dake struggled to stick out his face from the plump demonic beast and took in big breaths of fresh air. Just as he quietly took out Pride 2 and was about to use it on her, the demonic beast suddenly whispered in his ear, "Someone is coming." With a thought, Dark changed Pride 2 to a branch card. The demonic beast immediately turned into light and entered. Dake finally had the time to observe his surroundings. The walls of the Shung Malian castle were made of an unknown material. Even after being shot by the moon god's arrow, they were still intact. Only some traces of the explosion remained. He quickly skipped over those traces and found the white feather that remained in the black mud. Could this be? The only white feather that had appeared from the beginning to the end could only be that one. Dake was overjoyed. He quickly ran over and picked up the angel feather that was emitting a gentle white light from the mud. The angel's feather was pure and untainted. Just by looking at it, it gave people a very comfortable feeling. Dake opened the card pack and carefully hid it in the compartment. There were already 4 core materials in the interlayer of the card pack, which were the feather of a harpy, the scales of the mermaid ragdoll bear zombie button, the feather of the celestial beast. Patting his beloved card pack, Dake took out the magic pen and carefully stirred the mud that the moon goddess had turned into. After confirming that there was nothing else in it, he stood up. Even though he still didn't quite understand why the moon goddess suddenly disappeared. But sometimes the result was more important than the process. After confirming this, Dake didn't immediately run to the temple. There were men and women in the temple who were used as sacrifices, but there was also the Marine Order that was very dangerous to him. At this time, the best thing to do was to quietly wait for the professors to arrive. And the professors did indeed arrive not long after. The first to arrive wasn't Professor Kazair or Professor Li that Dake was most familiar with. Instead, it was a huge black bear. When the black bear ran over on all fours, Dake was really shocked. But the black bear slammed on the brakes and turned back into its human form. It was Professor Pawa Cheongsi. Looking at Professor Cheongsi's smooth bronze skin, Dake was slightly relieved. Dimung. Professor Cheongsi frowned and looked at Dake. Then, she waved the magic card in her hand and said, "Transfiguration card, a senior class." Dake said, "Oh." He knew about transfiguration. The transfiguration spell in Luo Boat was a type of transfiguration spell. But this was the first time he had seen a transfiguration card. But there shouldn't be many people who could master advanced transfiguration, like Professor Cheongsi, right? Professor Cheongsi's gaze quickly shifted to the pool of black mud. She quickly asked, "Why are you here? Do you know what happened here?" Dake shrugged. I know a little. There was no need to keep it a secret. After all, the dust had settled, and besides the last battle, he was just an innocent bystander. Professor Cheongsi breathed a sigh of relief and walked toward the mud. It's good that there are people who know. You can tell them when the principal comes. Pawa, I'm already here. With a flash of light, a small sprite flew between the two of them. It was a small sprite with a lion's body and a human's face. Dake naturally recognized it as one of the 9 sprites of the principal of Aerdi. As for the principal himself, he might still be hosting the ball. As he was thinking, Dake suddenly noticed a breeze blowing past him. Not far away, a person suddenly appeared at the entrance of the temple. It was Professor Sarah Shi-Erfu. Professor Shi-Erfu directly entered the temple. As soon as she opened her eyes, she saw the altar without the statue and the students in front of it. She immediately waved her hand, and a breeze blew out and directly passed through the students' bodies. When it returned, the breeze turned into a finger-sized wind sprite. How is it? Professor Shi-Erfu asked with concern. The wind sprite blinked and made an okay gesture with its small finger. Professor Shi-Erfu breathed a sigh of relief. It seemed that the students' lives were not in danger. Then, Dake followed Professor Cheongsi into the temple. The temple looked like it was after the event. The candles on the magic circuit had burned out, leaving only red fiery oil. 16 members of the Marine Order were unconscious on the ground, and the pink fog that covered them like spider silk had disappeared. Only 33 students were still unconscious because of the effect of the soulless water. The last black-haired girl who was knocked down by Dake was pretending to be dead. White Gouda. He felt like he had a nightmare, and he didn't want to wake up. Under the inquiry of the professors, Dark recounted everything that had happened to him that night. But when he talked about the beginning of the ceremony, he changed his story. He said that he failed to destroy the ceremony and was hunted down by the resurrected goddess of the moon. I slid out of extreme fear and successfully escaped from the temple. After that, the horrible existence who claimed to be the goddess of the moon took out her magic bow and shot at me with moonlight, as if she was hunting a stag. But she was obviously playing with me, and deliberately missed me several times. Finally, I found an opportunity and slid out again. Ahem, actually I don't know how she disappeared. Last night he fell asleep sitting up. When he opened his eyes, it was already 4 o'clock in the morning. Heartsuit. Chapter 111. After listening to Dake's explanation, both the professors and the principal quickly realized that there was one person missing. The moon goddess couldn't have disappeared into thin air, so there had to be a third party involved. The Sphinx walked around the temple and quickly said, "Take the students to the infirmary first. I'll inform Sister Kalien as soon as possible. Dimung, you did well, but you can leave the rest to the professors. Also, if you don't need to rest, don't miss the first ball. I'll be waiting for you in the banquet hall on the first floor." "Yes, Principal." Dake bowed slightly, said goodbye to the other 2 professors and quickly left. After Dake left, Professor Shi-Erfu looked away and muttered, "Pawa, what do you think of Daiming's words?" Professor Cheongsi smiled. "There are secrets, but which Magus doesn't have secrets? Let's go, at least he's on the good side of this matter." Professor Shi-Erfu, "Then what do you think about the third party?" Professor Cheongsi said indifferently, "Didi or Kaze, someone has to be responsible for this." URL: https://m. Vipcanshu. VIP. By the time Dake arrived at the banquet hall on the first floor, it was already past 12:30. Principal Aerdi waved her magic pen on the stage and performed many magic techniques in front of the Magi. Normally, she would have announced the winner of the masquerade ball by this time and given out the prizes. Then, she would have officially announced the start of the masquerade ball. But tonight, she was clearly stalling for time. She didn't stop showing off until Dake stepped into the banquet hall. She smiled and said, "Now, let's begin the award ceremony. Let's welcome the first grade's Red Star, Dake Dimung." Pa. A huge colored egg suddenly appeared on top of his head. As soon as Dake raised his head, the egg cracked open and a large amount of ribbons and paper flew out. Then Dake suddenly realized that he was already standing on the stage, to the left of Principal Aerdi. Principal Arte's silver hair was still as eye-catching as ever. Her beautiful face was covered with a 1/4 diamond mask, and she wore a silver crown on her head. She was wearing a pitch-black dress with a long skirt. She didn't look like a princess. Instead, she looked more like a vicious queen in fairy tales. Dimming, give me your hand. Yes, Principal. Dake stretched out his hands. Suddenly, an unusually heavy trophy appeared in his hands. Principal Arte's voice echoed in the hall. Come, let us congratulate this year's Crimson Star. The hall was instantly filled with thunderous applause. Principal of Aerdi. Dimming, do you have anything to say? Dake. It's too big. Principal Aerdi. Dake got off the stage in a daze. Never in his wildest dreams would he have thought that the trophy for the year's champion was actually such a huge golden cup. How many credits would he get if he sold it at Traveler's Street? However, as soon as he stepped off the stage, the trophy in his hand suddenly began to shrink. Wung. A trophy that was almost half the height of a person was forcibly turned into a palm-sized medal. No way, isn't this too much? Is there such a passionate consumer? Dake wanted to complain, but the trophy turned into a medal, as if it was a routine at the Halloween ball. Below the stage, there were cries of surprise that could only be heard from the first years. He flipped open the medal and saw the engraving on the back frowny face incantation. You deserve it. So he injected magic power into the medal and whispered, You deserve it. Suddenly, his hands sank, and the medal turned into a trophy that was almost half the height of a person. After turning the trophy back into a medal and pinning it to his chest, Dake found a random place to sit down. He didn't pay much attention to the rankings. He was just happy that he had become the champion of the first years. Next, the principal of Aerdi continued to give out the prizes. From the first to the 6th years, there were a total of 6 grade trophies. Then it was time for the overall champion, the winner of the Platinum Star. A total of 6 contestants went on stage one after another. Dake saw that the senior from Panduola had successfully become the champion of the 4th years, but unfortunately, she missed the Platinum Star. It seems that there are indeed hidden talents among the senior students. Dake. Yes. Deanna, who had squeezed over with great difficulty, sat down beside him, and a hint of milky fragrance seeped into his heart. She complained. Where have you been? We've been looking for you for a long time. Dake took a brand new glass of orange juice from the table, took a sip, and said with emotion, I was delayed by something. I just arrived. Oh. Deanna immediately smiled, and reached out to Dake's chest without hesitation. She grabbed the Crimson Star medal and looked at it carefully. Luosi walked over. Congratulations on becoming the champion. Dake is indeed the champion. Dake, thank you. Deanna came back to her senses and quickly said, Congratulations. Then she began to look forward to the ball. The two of them, who were wearing matching outfits, looked like a golden couple. Even in this evening ball, they were quite eye-catching. On the stage, the principal of Aerdi began the next segment, which was the princesses' meeting. It was because of the arrival of the 3 princesses that this masquerade ball was special. Everyone had been looking forward to it for a long time. The principal of Aerdi used his magic pen to draw a few flashing circles. Then, as if he was performing a magic trick, magic exploded like fireworks. Now let's welcome the princesses to the stage. Then the 3 princesses sitting at the professor's table got up and walked to the stage. Princess Elisha was wearing a standard palace dress. Except for the exquisite mask that covered her beauty, her bearing was still calm and elegant. Her temperament was noble and gentle. The many supporters of the eldest princess in the audience suddenly cheered. Xiao Naofu and Xiao Xiong, who didn't have much of a presence, also walked up the stage and very obediently walked to the 2 sides of the eldest princess. When the fanatical atmosphere subsided a little, the students noticed the 2 little princesses on the stage. Some people's expressions changed on the spot. Because the 2 little princesses had been running around the castle, most people had seen them. Some people had even been harassed by them. They were really naughty. And of course, they didn't treat the little princesses well. After the 3 princesses finished their self-introductions, It was finally time for the much-anticipated dance partner selection segment. The eldest princess took a step forward and looked at the students in the audience with a gentle gaze. The atmosphere between the students became tense. Ugh. Chapter 112. To the admirers of the first princess, being able to dance with the first princess at the Halloween banquet was undoubtedly an honor and a form of recognition. Of course, even without these miscellaneous things, it was something they could brag about for the rest of their lives. Elisha looked at the large number of students below the stage and slightly pursed her lips. She actually hadn't thought about it yet. She was different from her two younger sisters who could take advantage of their age to have fun everywhere. She was the representative of the palace and was now the core of the faction, so she couldn't overindulge herself. Thus, she had to be very careful when choosing her dance partner this time. First, she had to eliminate males. And if she could only choose from females, she had to consider strength, appearance, character, and family background. The lazy way to do it was to directly choose a female from the previous champions. Elisa was more interested in Pandora Doragon, the super popular duelist who had countless fans under the name of Silver Dragon Lady. But that Silver Dragon Lady was really too outstanding. Remember the website, MVIP can't you? VIP as a princess, Elisha had to be careful not to let her glory be stolen by the people around her. Thus, she could only apologize. If possible, it was best not to choose the noble house. She couldn't show that she was biased towards a noble. In that case, it would be best to pick a quiet and intelligent girl from the Magic Engineering Institute. Elisha's gaze wandered around the banquet hall. After the transformation of the school card, the information of the students continuously entered her mind. She finally locked onto 4 targets. Coincidentally, these 4 targets were all girls who were seriously flipping through books at this time of the banquet, and one of them wasn't even from the mage house. Of the 4 targets, she eliminated the one whose appearance didn't match, and then eliminated the one who was dressed strangely. In the end, only the third-year student Winnie Scatty and the first-year student AI Ma Métis were left. Métis is a good girl, but she's still too young. My invitation might bring unnecessary burden to her, so I'll choose Miss Scatty. I remember this surname. Is she a descendant of the Sage of Winter? Thus Elisha read out the name Winnie Scatty. Winnie didn't pay much attention to the princess's invitation. It was only when her classmates reminded her that she raised her head in surprise. However, since she had received the princess's favor, she wasn't someone who didn't know what was good for her. She immediately used the costume change card to change into a more formal outfit and walked towards the stage. Elisha looked at her new outfit and nodded her head in satisfaction. She then turned to her sisters and asked, "What about you two? Do you have anyone in mind?" "I was waiting for you to say that." Anna immediately jumped up. But just as she was about to yell, and she kicked her in the heel, Anna's mouth suddenly stiffened, and she said reservedly, "Sister Mary, are you willing to dance with me tonight?" Mary, a second-year student, would never have guessed that the little tiger that fell from the sky was the second princess. She immediately panicked, thinking that her casual clothes were really inappropriate, so she hurriedly borrowed a disguise card from her classmate. "It's finally my turn." And she, the third princess, stood on her tiptoes and glanced down. She quickly found her target and said, "Dake Dake." "Huh?" Anna suddenly turned her head and stared at her sister. "What's going on? You little traitor." And she ignored her and immediately waved her little paw with all her might. She even jumped a little while she was at it. Deanna's face suddenly darkened. "What's going on? Didn't they say that people who liked bears were not bad people?" She was a traitor to bears. "'Tis they." Dake put down the knife that he had just picked up, took off his napkin, and stood up helplessly. What's so good about being invited by the princess? It's tiring and exhausting. After the incident in the secret passage, he was actually a little tired. He just wanted to eat something quietly and replenish his energy. There was still a fierce battle to be fought tonight. Deanna seemed to have noticed Dake's reluctance, so she was happy again. After all, there was more than one dance tonight. What's wrong with accepting the princess invitation? The bear of the kingdom was the most loyal defender of the kingdom. Deanna wanted to cry and laugh at the same time. The little cutie Luo-si quickly picked up a syrup cake and stuffed it into her mouth. Ah! The melody in the banquet hall gradually changed from light to elegant. The three students who were favored by the princess walked onto the stage. Panduola leaned back in her chair, the corners of her snow-white wedding dress scattered carelessly. She threw the star of aquamarine medal on the table casually. She raised her hand, and between her thumb and forefinger was the tip of a knuckle of a horn. That was the remnant of the horn of the legendary monster, Bichimos. The magic contained in it was actually very weak, but it was still a good material for making high-level magic cards. Through the circle formed by the horn and her fingers, the scene on the stage came into her eyes. Like a sniper, she locked her vision on the little bear's head. Boom! Ai Ma didn't know that she had almost become the eldest princess dance partner. She had accepted the invitation of a senior, and already had an appointment tonight. Dake Dimming walked onto the stage. Then he casually stepped over the second princess's outstretched hand. Since it was a masquerade ball, there was no need to wear formal clothes like a formal ball. Whether it was Anna or Angie, both of them continued to wear their costumes. Dake nodded slightly at the eldest princess who turned her head, and went to the third princess and she. Dake, you didn't expect this, did you? And she whispered. Dake responded lazily. Yeah, I really didn't expect this. And she said, when we dance later, follow me and teach the old witch a lesson. The old witch. That's a memory from a long time ago. Dake narrowed his eyes slightly, thinking that he would jump up and take Anchi away later. So let's party together. The melody of the music suddenly rose. The students who had already found their dance partners were suddenly excited. The students who didn't have a dance partner hid in the corner and ate their pumpkin pies hard. Panduola gently blew on a magic elf card. Dragon Maiden with dragon horns on her head lifted her skirt slightly and reached out to pull her up from her seat. The senior dancing with Ai Ma was the one who quarreled with her at the women's party. Deanna unwillingly held hands with Luo-si. The dark princess and the pure white sergeant were a match made in heaven. Deanna stared at the little bear on the stage, and suddenly felt a little immersed in it. Then she mumbled to herself, I am the little bear is me. On the stage, the three princesses formed three corners and danced leisurely to the melody. Dake and Anchi held hands and danced to the melody. Under the blessing of the Shungmalian, they achieved peace of mind. Until a tiger cub quietly poked its head over. He stepped hard without hesitation. Ow. Thank you, Big Shots, for your support. I'm super stable. My dad will go back in the afternoon. There will be fewer things to do. I've been really busy and tired these days. Fortunately, I didn't pull my legs. Chapter 113. Anna, who was in so much pain that tears were about to fall from her eyes. She couldn't help but hold Mary's hand tightly and look at her with tears in her eyes. However, Mary was actually a smart girl. How could she not see that it was second princess who made the first move? She pretended not to see and led Anna to the other side. The second princess glared fiercely at Dark, but she was met with Angie's gloating gaze. The song was over. Dake let go of Anchi's hand, made a standard aristocratic bow, and was about to walk off the stage. Anchi suddenly grabbed his hand and whispered, Next year, Anna and I will also enter the school. Dake had an idea and congratulated him in advance. Congratulations. Angie retracted her hand with a chuckle. Remember this. https://m. Vip can't you? VIP Dake then walked off the stage. However, he thought in his heart, if these two devil incarnate enter the school, it will be a disaster. After walking off the stage, Dake was quickly taken away by Deanna. The Dark Prince and the Dark Princess finally held hands in the second song. Deanna was still not very familiar with the dance steps, so Dake taught her step by step. Then the third song, the fourth song, the two of them were together. Deanna was all smiles and glanced at the professor's table from time to time. Most of the professors did not step onto the dance floor. Beside Professor Li, who was lying on the table, Anna and Anchi, who had taken off their headgear, were tearing each other apart. Princess Elisha was whispering to the principal on the other side. The masquerade party was still lively. However, The Shungmalian castle did not seem to have returned to peace. At the moment in the infirmary, White Gouda finally woke up, under the treatment of Sister Kalien. When he saw himself in the mirror, he was so excited that he burst into tears. Instead of just standing there, "Why don't you come and help me out? Let's have a nice Halloween party." Sister Kalien muttered profanities that shouldn't come out of a nun's mouth. She quickly concocted a potion to neutralize the soulless water. White blushed. Just as she was about to help, Professor Shi-Erfu called her out. Under Professor Shi-Erfu's scrutiny, White had no choice but to tell Professor Shi-Erfu what happened after he was attacked in front of the secret passage. Professor Shi-Erfu listened carefully and cross-checked with Dake's words to confirm that neither of them was lying. Then, she received the mental examination report on the members of the church from Sister Kalien's hands. She immediately understood everything. The whole thing was actually not that complicated. It was just that someone had used the statue of the moon goddess to do something. She might not be a forerunner, but she was definitely a promoter. Most of the participants, including the moon goddess, were merely chess pieces dancing in his palm. In the Shungmalian castle, the only people who could do such a thing were naturally professors. And the only professors who weren't in the banquet hall at midnight tonight were Professor Kazair and Professor Didi. Thinking of the past of those two, Professor Shi-Erfu sighed slightly. No wonder I felt that something was wrong when I was patrolling with Didi at night a few days ago. The little sphinx floated on her shoulder, and Principal Aerdiai's voice came out of it. "Take White with you. We're going to the spiral clock tower." However, Professor Shi-Erfu didn't take any action. Suddenly, there was a loud explosion in the direction of the spiral clock tower. Boom! A golden lightning bolt that almost tore the night sky apart fell straight down. Thunder suddenly exploded at the top of the spiral clock tower. The magic power in the castle was disturbed, and the magic lights in the banquet hall on the first floor instantly went out. The melody of the party also came to an abrupt end. The students who were originally immersed in the joyous atmosphere were suddenly shocked and panicked by the series of changes. The juniors couldn't help but scream. Darkness and chaos swept over. Some students hurriedly took out their magic cards. But the magic elves that were summoned by mistake further added to the chaos. Dake was only nervous for a moment, but he quickly calmed down. He confirmed the direction in the darkness and looked straight at the place where the thunder came from. Deanna immediately lay on top of him, but Dake wasn't sure if Deanna was really afraid. Ding ding ding. The crisp sound of wind chimes rang in the air. Huge wind chimes that were emitting a pale yellow light flew to every corner of the banquet hall. The light in the banquet hall was restored. Dake patted Deanna's shoulder, and the latter pursed her lips and raised her head. She said blankly, "It's morning." "Morning, my ass." Dake pushed her head away and said in a low voice, "I have something to do." Before Deanna could react, he had already retreated into the crowd and disappeared in the blink of an eye. An arc of lightning flashed outside the window of the banquet hall again, but it was far less shocking than the first time. Dark clouds suddenly came and covered the bright moon. It started to rain heavily in the Shungmalian sky. Dake came to the gate of the castle and looked at the Night Prince suit on his body. He quickly took out the change card and changed into the Night Mask suit. Wearing a tall hat, he lowered his head and rushed into the rain. The rain came very quickly and was very unusual. Through the continuous rain, one could see the top of the spiral clock tower emitting a blazing light. Dake confirmed the source of the first thunder, and immediately took out the branch card and summoned his familiar. The little demon beast, who was still in the form of a demonic beast, deliberately stuck to Dake's back and whispered in his ear. Dake ignored her. "Take me up." The demonic beast looked serious and immediately hugged him. "Yes, master." Thus, the master and the pet flew to the top of the spiral clock tower in the pouring rain. But on the other side, Professor Shi-Erfu, who had turned into the wind, was faster than him. White, who was originally standing with her, had just climbed onto the back of the Sphinx when Professor Shi-Erfu appeared at the top of the spiral clock tower. Not long after, Dake flew to the top of the tower with the help of the demonic beast. Professor Shi-Erfu did not even look at him and recognized him. "Dimming, stay away." Dake's heart tightened, and his gaze swept across the top of the tower. At the top of the tower, Professor Kazair was kneeling on one knee, surrounded by 8 shields. Above his head, a snow-feathered golden-eyed beast was letting out a shrill cry. The magical fairy, which was only the size of a kitten, had now become the size of a lion. Its snow-white wings were angrily spread out, and its eyes were shining with golden light. In front of Professor Kazair, the fairy, who was about the same height as him, was holding her magic wand high, the butterfly wings on her back flapping rapidly. Dake had seen it in a book before. It was an old magic wand that was on par with the god's wrath. Thunder's might. Boom. Another bolt of lightning flashed across the sky, reflecting the fairy's face. Although she was a little immature, however, her exquisite facial features all spoke volumes of her beauty. Chapter 114. The moment Dake saw that face, an image suddenly appeared in his mind. In Professor Kazair's office, the flower card decorated with green roses reflected a faint light under the light. The professor reached out and pressed the card. The green roses on the card floated out, and a slightly young and beautiful face appeared on the card. It was a fairy with butterfly wings. Pure and simple green roses symbolized the blessings of eternal youth and hope for everlasting love. Dake originally thought that the fairy was Professor Kazair's old flame. Now that he thought about it, his guess was probably right. The fairy in front of him, who was holding godly thunder, had the same face. Website: https://m. vipcanchu. VIP. When Dake saw this fairy, he suddenly realized that the only fairy in the academy with butterfly wings was Professor Didi Makeseaway from the History of Magic. He compared the two. In addition to being younger, this fairy's wings and clothes were exactly the same as Professor Didi's. So, this is the reason why Professor Kazair showed such a contradictory attitude? He didn't want to destroy Professor Didi's plan, but he also wanted to do something because of his conscience. So he came to me, hoping that I would investigate, participate, and make the decision for him. Human emotions are really complicated. Dake didn't follow Professor Shirfu's instructions to stay further away. Instead, he jumped down and landed on the top of the spiral clock tower. He half-squatted on the ground, and beside him was the demoness, who also landed. Professor Didi looked at Professor Sarah Shirfu and Dake Dimming, who came one after another, but he didn't say a word. Instead, Professor Shirfu was surprised. "Didi, your curse was lifted?" Only then did Professor Didi reveal a gentle smile. "I completed a small experiment." Professor Shirfu's voice pierced through the storm. "This doesn't look like a small experiment." Professor Didi played it down. "I just copied a small part of history." Then she opened her palm, and a bead emitting the light of the silver moon slowly floated up. A bright moon floated in the middle of the bead. Amidst the thunderstorm, it became the only moon. "Tear of the Moon Goddess?" Professor Shirfu's voice was filled with indescribable surprise. "How did you do it?" Professor Didi took back the Tear of the Moon Goddess and whispered, "I said I just copied a small part of history." She waved her wand, and lightning flashed. She didn't want to say more. Professor Kazel said, "This involves the location of the castle and the historical imaging." Professor Didi turned to look at him. "Kazel, you are indeed knowledgeable. Goblins are always goblins." Professor Kazair's eyebrows twitched. "Didi." Professor Didi didn't stop. "Do you know why I would rather suffer the torture of the curse than choose you? Because goblins' blood stinks." Her eyebrows became higher and higher, and her tone became colder and colder. As a long-lived species, goblins were not only blessed by time, but they also had eternal youth. They were closer to the perfect species in fantasy than their close relatives, the elves. Goblins with extreme bloodline ideology were arrogant. In their eyes, even humans were just insects on the ground, not to mention the dirty goblins living underground. Didi Makeseaway, as a representative of extreme bloodline ideology, once aged because of the curse. She fell from fantasy and became equal to others. But after recovering her youth with the Tear of the Moon Goddess, her nature surfaced again. In the end, the reason why she became old was because of an ancient temple. In the past, when she went deep into an ancient temple to explore, She was faced with difficulties from the will of the moon. Between love and time, she chose time, and thus suffered the curse of the moon goddess. And the love she rejected at that time was Professor Kazair. They used to be companions on adventures, and now they were colleagues in the academy. Unfortunately, their relationship stopped there. Professor Kazair slowly stood up. There was no resentment in his eyes. Even if Professor Didi pointed out that his blood stinks in front of the students, he didn't care. Instead, his eyes were filled with memories and nostalgia. Didi had been like this from the beginning. She had a completely different personality from Li, who was also a goblin. But what attracted his attention was this stubborn arrogance. The test of time was too cruel. There were only 3 people left in the original team of 4. In a few decades, there would be 1 less person. Goblins had a higher lifespan than humans, but they couldn't compare to goblins who could race against time. Kazair knew that he was old. He appeared here tonight to see Didi for the last time. Didi still had a sense of propriety, and there were no casualties among the students. In Shengmalian, this was a red line. As long as she didn't cross this red line, the principal wouldn't do anything to her. But she would definitely be expelled. Kazair, who had been feeling powerless year after year, had already thought of retiring in Shengmalian. He was no longer in the mood to explore with the energetic Didi. The long lifespan brought the goblins an almost endless curiosity, always following the footsteps of history, searching for the truth in the fog and dust, was the way of life of most goblins. Professor Li, who was still lying on the professor's seat, looked weak. She stretched her arms and turned over, floating on the edge of the table, looking at the gradually brightening ceiling. Her eyes were full of confusion. Since you care so much, why don't you go and take a look? The gentle voice of the principal of Aerdii sounded in her ears. Professor Li muttered. What's the use of going and taking a look? What needs to go will still go. The principal of Aerdii continued to ask. You already knew. Professor Li turned over again, facing the floor. So what? Aerdii, sigh. In the blink of an eye, another huge figure appeared on the spiral clock tower. It was Professor Cheongsi, who had transformed into a giant bear. Professor Didi was surrounded by 3 professors, but she didn't care at all. She turned her eyes to the flying sphinx. One of the 9 elves of the principal of Aerdii, the sphinx, which had transformed into a physical body, was flying quickly with the hero in the prophecy on its back. Professor Didi glanced at the hero wearing the vampire Earl suit, and inadvertently looked at another student present. The corners of her mouth curled up slightly. She revealed a thought-provoking smile. Prophecy. Chapter 115. White Gouda was carried by the Sphinx to the top of the spiral clock tower. The strong wind and heavy rain almost knocked him off the tower. He could only wrap his arms around the Sphinx's neck tightly to prevent himself from falling. After sliding down from the Sphinx's back, White looked at the top of the tower in a daze. He didn't understand why the principal of Aerdii had asked him to come along. This was because his understanding of how things had developed was really limited. He didn't even know why Professor Kazair was here. Where did that little fairy who looked like Professor Didi come from? Professor Shi-Erfa didn't have time to tell him all this. He felt like an idiot. The only magic card left in his hand was the taboo love that betrayed him at the critical moment. Speaking of forbidden love, he remembered the URL. Vipkanshu. 6 taboo love, return to normal. The little person formed by the pink mist responded to him again. He didn't dare to peek at the favorability. The only thing he could do was peek at the favorability from the statue of the goddess. In short, he was very confused. Especially when he saw the perverted gentleman on the other side of the tower, he was even more confused. Why is he here? Who are you talking about? The principal's voice came out of the Sphinx's mouth. White pursed his lips and didn't respond, but the principal of Aerdii noticed that he was looking at Dake. The principal of Aerdii continued to speak through the Sphinx. If you're talking about Dimung, he just left the dance. 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 White's face turned pale. He suddenly realized that he had missed his first dance as a student. On the weekend, he was still excitedly picking out his makeup clothes. Before that, he even fantasized about inviting his senior from Panduola to dance with him after he won the grade championship. But now, forget about the grade championship, he even missed the dance. He was too ashamed to talk about what happened after tonight. Wait, that's Dake? White felt that his neck was a little too stiff. His buttocks even hurt faintly. He swallowed his saliva. Thinking about how he had changed into the masked knight suit, he shouldn't have been recognized, right? Amidst the thunderstorm, Dake of course noticed White's arrival. He wasn't surprised. But what surprised him was that the headmaster of Erdii did not come in person. Could it be? He quickly figured out something. It was different from White. After Dake recognized Professor Didi, he quickly sorted out his thoughts and made a rough guess about the ins and outs of this incident. What Professor Didi referred to as the reproduction of history. Professor Kazair mentioned the location of the castle and the historical image. It also gave him some inspiration. He was more interested in the meaning of these words than the incident itself. When the dust settles, I must find a chance to investigate. With this thought in mind, Dake turned his head and looked at the scene. Professor Shi-Erfu glanced at the Sphinx and seemed to have realized something. She simply stepped forward and said, "Didi, put down the wand. We can mediate tonight's matter." Professor Didi was surprised. "No way, Sarah. What do I need to mediate? A student riot? Or the resurrection of the moon goddess? Don't distort the facts. In order to prevent those bad eggs from doing something irreversible, I've been taking care of them all this time. Even the remnant will of the ruler of the moon was dealt with by me. In the end, do you want to give me an excellent professor award? Then I really don't think it's necessary." Professor Shi-Erfu couldn't help but frown. Professor Didi pursed her lips and smiled. "Okay, it's just a joke. I left a resignation letter in the office. Let Erdii get it himself. Also, help me pass a message to Lili." Professor Shi-Erfu, "What is it?" Professor Didi, "Just say that I'm going to play first." As soon as she finished speaking, she suddenly raised godly thunder. And the terrifying thunder that seemed to explode a castle sounded again. Didi Maxiwei had already turned into lightning and broke through the curtain of rain. The Shungmalian barrier was instantly torn apart, and only a golden dragon could be seen galloping away. Professor Didi had already disappeared. "It's over." Professor Kazair sighed and put the 8 shields and the snow-feathered golden-eyed beast back into the card. Professor Cheongsi also turned back into human form and looked at Professor Shi-Erfu. Then, Professor Cheongsi shrugged and said humorously, "Maybe Didi's method is not bad?" Professor Shi-Erfu said seriously, "Pawa, this is a lie." Professor Cheongsi, "But we have to admit that sometimes a lie is easier to accept than the truth." Professor Shi-Erfu, "But that's not a reason to lie." Professor Cheongsi, "Lie? No, we don't lie. We only state the truth, a part of the truth." Professor Shi-Erfu was silent for a while and finally said, "Let the principal decide." As they spoke, the two of them looked at the Sphinx. The Sphinx? Winky face? Professor Cheongsi. The principal escaped. On the first floor of the castle, in the banquet hall, Principal Erdii stood by the window and stared at the rain. He couldn't help but sigh. The rain is really heavy tonight. Princess Elisha walked to his side and smiled. The thunder is even louder. The masquerade ball ended in the storm. Even though the students were still somewhat unsatisfied, the 2 thunderous booms from before and after had drawn their attention elsewhere. Under the guidance of the heads of the different faculties, the students all returned to their respective common rooms. However, when they arrived at the common rooms, most of them were excitedly guessing what the 2 explosions were about. Soon after, some people realized that the students they couldn't find in the banquet hall didn't return to the common rooms. This caused further chaos. In the tower of the aristocrat house, Dirk, who had eaten too much, slowly pushed open the door to the common room. He immediately realized that he had become the center of attention. The head of the class, who hadn't spoken much before, was the first to run over and ask with concern, "Dimming? Why are you only back now? Where's Seekheat? Where's Stan? Where's Bex?" Dake was a little speechless. "Head of the class, I'm just a first-year student who's been here for 2 months. I can't say a bunch of names like you can. Ryan quickly shut his mouth and smiled awkwardly. Dake said, Don't worry, they just ran into a little trouble. They might have to spend the night in the infirmary. Oh yeah, Sister Kalien told me to tell everyone not to disturb the patient's rest. Also, if we don't go back to our rooms, we might be the ones lying in the infirmary tomorrow. It's almost 2 o'clock. He yawned and walked towards the stairs. Ryan quickly asked, What kind of trouble? Dake. The principal will announce it tomorrow. I have to keep it a secret. Therefore, Dake used his prestige as the principal of ARTI to successfully escape from the common room. He walked up the stairs to the second floor. When he turned the corner, other than the 2 kids, the rest of the students immediately began a new round of discussion. They were abnormally excited. Chapter 116. Dake poured the freshly squeezed apple juice and pear juice into 2 glasses, and gave them to Deanna and Luosi. The 2 girls had already fallen in love with the taste of the 2 juices. They took the glasses and sipped them. Dake poured himself a glass of water and asked casually, So, what do you want to know? Deanna. Everything, of course. Luosi put her hand on Dake's waist and whispered, Is it over? Dake. It's over for now. Luosi patted her chest and sighed in relief. That's good. After saying that, she pulled Diana along and said good night before leaving. Dake walked them out of the door and locked it again. Then his face turned gloomy. What happened tonight was beyond his expectations. He was not as relaxed as he appeared to be. It's already a new month. Next, while his mind was still clear, he planned to check his index of major crimes and come up with some new plans. But before that, it might be a good idea to take a shower. Even though his hair was dried, he was still wet. If he was not careful, he might have to go to the infirmary during the day. The first day of November was Halloween. It was a Wednesday, so there was a day off. Dark soaked himself in the bathtub filled with hot water for half an hour. Squinting his eyes, he recalled everything that had happened tonight. Suddenly, he noticed that the short-haired girl he had beaten up in the temple seemed to be wearing the same makeup as Victor. No way. Thinking about what happened to Luoboat, Dake suddenly had a bad feeling. After taking a shower, Dake dried his hair, put on a towel, and walked out of the bathroom. But as soon as he took a step out, he immediately ran back. Are you clean? Professor Lily's lazy voice came from the bed in the bedroom. Dake took a bigger towel and wrapped himself in it before going out to pick up his clothes. Professor, breaking into a student's dormitory is not something a decent fairy would do. Professor Lily immediately patted his chest and breathed a sigh of relief. Fortunately, I'm not a serious demon. Meow meow meow. The cat grass climbed onto the bed and rubbed against her arm. She played with the cat grass in her arms and said casually, Dake, I didn't expect you to be interested in raising cats. Dake, that's grass. Lily, it's a cat. Cat grass, meow. Dake put on his pajamas and changed into them in the bathroom. Then he walked out of the bathroom and said, So Professor, you came so late just to pet the cat? Professor Lily was focused on stroking the cat, and was not in the mood to pay attention to him. After a while, she curled up on the bed and sat up. She placed the catnip plant on her knees and gestured for Dake to sit beside her. The little fairy always gave off a clean and fresh aura like the wilderness. Dake sat down beside her and prepared himself to listen. Professor Lily calmed down by stroking the cat and said softly, Dake, have you ever liked someone? Dake shook his head. Professor Lily, I thought so too. You're still so young. Dake suddenly said, What about you? Professor Lily said proudly, Of course I do. I'm already so old. Dake took the opportunity to ask a question that he had always wanted to ask. How old are you, Professor? Professor Lily, not old. Only about 200 years old. Dake did a rough calculation and said in surprise, Isn't that still a child? Lily, hey, you're so annoying. I'm not a child. Dake, Professor Lily, you humans have a short lifespan. You're gone in the blink of an eye. Ailey is like that, Pudge is like that, and Amu is like that. Dake, who are they? Professor Lily, Ailey. She's my earliest friend. Even before Dee Dee. She's really gentle and good at cooking. Her vanilla biscuits are especially delicious. She's about the same height as me, but she knows everything. Unfortunately, I went home one day and didn't see her again. Dake, what about Pudge? Pudge. Professor Lily rested his chin on his hand and thought for a while. He's a butcher, but every time he kills a pig, he will go to the church to confess. I heard that he later married a nun, had a baby, and became a doctor. Dake, what about Amu? Professor Lily was silent for a while. Amu. Amu is my best friend. He's amazing. He's only a teenager, but he's better at using a sword than I am. We signed up for an adventure team and always ran into dangerous places. He was the one who saved me every time. Dake. Adventure team? Professor Lily. Yes, a 4-person adventure team. Me, Didi, Kazair, and Amu. As she spoke, she took out a beautiful card decorated with blue flowers. It was a blue rose, a kind of blue rose that rarely grew naturally. Pure love and honest kindness, the blue enchantress who kept her promise. Professor Lily injected magic power into the card, and the blue roses bloomed one after another. As the flowers floated out of the card and scattered outwards, a face appeared on the card. It was a human youth with a round face and a sweet smile, like an angel. Dake had seen it once, on the day Professor Lily got drunk. Time passed and the night was long. Professor Lily held the card and told the story of her, Amu, Didi, and Kazair. Those were the happiest, most exciting, and most memorable days of her life in the past 200 years. The cowardly and kind young swordsman, the arrogant and stubborn little fairy mage, the mischievous little fairy sage, and the goblin alchemist who was both a father and a mother. No matter who it was, they all had their strengths and weaknesses. No matter who it was, they all had their strengths and weaknesses. Only by taking care of each other and making up for each other could they move forward for a long time. It was only 5 years, but Lily felt that it was a period longer than 50 years. The 5th year of the trip. Relying on a tattered map, they found an ancient temple that had been buried for an unknown period of time under the uninhabited forest. There were all kinds of murals carved in the temple, quietly explaining the history of the past. Many statues were placed in the depths of the temple. Some were broken, some were intact. Some were completely abandoned, and some had remnants of divine consciousness. It wasn't until they entered a temple that worshipped the moon god that they encountered the biggest crisis since the team was established. It wasn't easy to break through all the thorns, but it triggered the last remnant consciousness of the moon god. The 4 of them could only leave the temple after enduring the final test. The so-called test was to choose between love and time. Didi chose time. Kazair chose love. Lily chose love. Amu chose time. Dake fished out the cat grass and covered Lily with a blanket. Oh. Chapter 117. Short stories with hidden meanings were always thought-provoking. But if the story happened to the people around him, it would not be so pleasant. Dake drank a glass of apple juice, opened the door, and quietly left his dormitory. He still had a lot of things to do, and he could not stop because of a little sadness. At 3 o'clock in the morning, the tower finally quieted down, and there was no other sound in the corridor. It was the first time Dake stepped on the stairs to the upper level, and the sound of his footsteps seemed to be in sync with his heartbeat, all the way to the 8th floor. The 8th floor of the tower was the dual practice room, and the top floor was the observatory. After the Shungmalian entered the 2nd grade, the students would form their own clubs, and the dual club was just one of them. The dual practice room on the 8th floor of the tower was usually occupied by the members of the dual club, and the observatory was the domain of the astrology club. The astrology club was also known as the astronomy club, and these 2 names were interchangeable. If Professor Didi was still around, the following astronomy class would probably teach about astrology. First website. https://m. Vipcanchu. VIP Professor Didi was also an astrologer. Dake glanced at the dual practice room, turned around, and continued to go up into the observatory. The storm had already stopped, and the night sky was clear again. He circled around the telescope in the observatory, then stopped and summoned the demonic beast. The demonic beast yawned, blinked, and her eyelashes trembled slightly, and wanted to stick to Dake. Dake was a little helpless. Demonic beast, when can you change back? The demonic beast was puzzled. Why do I have to change back? Dake coughed. You see, if you don't change back, isn't it inconvenient? You don't want to stay in the branch card all the time, right? That's true. The demonic beast thought about it, and felt that it was the case. Dake successfully tricked her to stand guard at the side, and said in his heart, expand the indicators. Yes. A moment later, 7 indicators appeared in Dake's vision. Pride 105, jealousy 42, rage 94, sloth 62, greed 89, gluttony 62, bliss 111. In general, other than bliss, the growth of these 7 indicators was still within his control. Pride, which was originally the most threatening skill, was successfully reduced by 10 points with the help of the magical brain dropper. Its growth last month was also controlled, and it only increased by 3 points. In the end, it went from 112 points at the beginning of last month to 105 points now. It was quite acceptable. After that, jealousy dropped another 2 points. This was mostly due to the fact that the melon was big and sweet enough. Similarly, fury had also decreased because of this. Because of the catgrass, the value of fury had actually reached the bottom of 90. However, it had been difficult to control his temper recently, so it had risen a little. However, it was still down from 96 at the beginning of last month. Next was sloth. Sloth rebounded by 2 points, so it wasn't a big problem. Gluttony also rebounded by 4 points. It wasn't a big problem either. It was this greed that increased by a whole 7 points. However, there was nothing he could do about it. As the temptation increased, greed became harder to suppress. Just like bliss, it was the same. From 90 points at the beginning of last month to 111 points now, most of it had increased overnight, but it was also related to Dake's own negligence. Fortunately, it was only bliss. Dake breathed a sigh of relief and took out a flower card from his shoulder bag. At the beginning of the elimination of the goddess, he had thought that this flower card was likely to lose its effectiveness. However, just now, Professor Lily had demonstrated it on the spot. That meant that the function of the flower card itself was still there. What he needed to test now was whether the derivative function of using the flower card to absorb bliss was still there. Dake put the flower card on the table, took out a magic pen, and began to inject magic power into it. As magic power was injected, familiar faces kept flashing on the surface of the card one by one. Dake held his breath and focused. Suddenly, he saw that the flowers on the surface of the card had changed. Sharp mouths with fine teeth grew out of the stamens. He continued to inject magic power. Several flowers drilled out of the surface of the card, and countless stamens and sharp mouths bit at his fingers wildly. Hiss. The demonic beast on the side merely glanced at it and waved her hand. With a flash of black light, the stamens were cut off at the root. Bliss -1. Not bad. The bliss -1 that floated in his vision made Dake smile. However, other than the experiment itself, there was another meaning to this experiment. He carefully put away the remains of the flower card, but his gaze could not help but turn to the deep and dark castle. The flower card could absorb the essence of bliss, which originated from the existence of the moon goddess statue. Now that the statue was gone, the flower card's effect was still there. How many unknown things are hidden in this castle? After returning to the dorm, Dake glanced at the little fairy and the big bed. In the end, he did not wrong himself. Instead, he took out a new quilt from the cupboard and slept on the other side of the big bed. He had a beautiful dream of running in the wilderness of nature to his heart's content. When most of the students had entered the land of dreams, after sending off the 3 princesses, Professor Aerdi came to Professor Didi's office and opened the resignation letter lying quietly on the desk. The letter did not use magic. Instead, it used the simplest words to describe Professor Didi's inner torment over the past 10 years and the recent events in detail. The style of the letter was gloomy at the beginning, but it gradually became lighter towards the end. It showed the constant changes in her heart. I see. Professor Aerdi carefully read the entire letter, and his brows gradually relaxed. The root of the matter was that a student had mistakenly entered the secret passage. The student, who was heartbroken, did not leave the secret passage in time. Instead, he slowly went deeper into the passage. He did not leave any traces on the path like Dake did, and it did not take long for him to get lost. Professor Aerdi still remembered this incident. In the end, it was Professor Didi who rescued the missing student from the secret passage. It took a long time for the student to realize that he was lost, and then he fell into despair due to his hunger and thirst. He took out his anger on his girlfriend who proposed to break up with him, and kept accumulating curses and hatred. After the despair, he began to recall the sweetness of the past. In the end, he continued to move forward like a corpse, praying for God's forgiveness and salvation. At that moment, the temple of the goddess of the moon appeared. Professor Didi did not discover the temple at first. The student had concealed the information. Later, he was bewitched by the remnant thoughts of the goddess. He formed a church, studied the flower cards, repaired the statue, and exposed himself again. Because someone was paying attention to him, Professor Didi noticed his abnormality, and then quickly found the temple. But after discovering that it was the temple of the goddess of the moon, she did not stop it. The traces of time became more and more obvious on her body. She could not restrain her desire to find a way to break the curse. Then, observe, investigate, participate, cover. After the Luo boat incident, in order not to be discovered by Professor Shi-Erfu, she even covered for Dake when he first entered the secret passage. Chapter 118. The first day of November. Wednesday. The day of Halloween. 6 o'clock in the morning. Lily Laplace woke up in a slight chill. Meow, she smacked her lips and opened her eyes a little. He saw a short-haired cat lying on his bed and licking his ears. Stop it. Lily, who realized that this was not her home, tried to wake up. Remember the URL, MFIP can't you? 6. She slowly got out of the quilt and exhaled slightly. Then she saw the blonde boy curled up next to her. Hee. Looking at Dake's sleeping face, Lily couldn't help but reach out her finger and carefully poked his face. It was soft, like a jelly pudding. She retracted her finger. The extremely elastic skin returned to its original state along the retracted fingertip. Lily stopped after a slight touch. Go back and take a nap. The little fairy flapped her wings and slowly returned to her little house. Dark, on the other hand, was still asleep. He hadn't slept so deeply in a long time. When all the heavy burdens were put down, his body and soul became comfortable, and his sleepiness was particularly high. It wasn't until 9:30 that Dake suddenly opened his eyes. He immediately checked the sloth indicator, but found that it didn't increase. Is it because I slept late enough? Or is it because I really need to sleep for so long? Dake, who came back to his senses, quickly noticed that Professor Lily left without saying goodbye. He didn't care too much. After that, he washed up and changed his clothes, used the garbage slime to cover his face, and ushered in a new day. The demon beast that came out of the branch card still didn't turn back into a little demon beast. Probably because it absorbed too much power from the goddess statue, the evolution this time lasted for an extra long time. Dake had no choice but to go to the cafeteria to eat breakfast in person. The students probably woke up at this time, and there were surprisingly many people in the cafeteria. They were still discussing the same topics as in the early morning. Occasionally, there was mention of Halloween gifts. But they were all things like toffee apples, chocolate biscuits, and the like. Halloween was still different from Christmas, and gifts were not so important. After breakfast, Dake went to the infirmary. He hadn't found a chance to return White's magic card the previous night, so he'd thought of coming here to look for Luo Boat and pass it on to White through Luo Boat. Is Sister Kalien here? Dake carefully pushed the door open. She saw that Sister Kalien was still sleeping on the table. She was obviously exhausted. The side of her face was full of fatigue. Dake didn't have the heart to wake her up, so he quietly walked into the infirmary and found Luo Boat Broheim among the patients outside. Luo Boat slept happily as if he didn't know anything. Dake put White's cards in a bag and put it on his bed. Then he prepared to leave the infirmary. But just as he was about to turn around, he noticed that more than half of the patients in the infirmary were on intravenous drips. But unlike ordinary intravenous infusions, the infusion needle was pierced into the temple of the brain. The potion bottle hanging by the bed was spherical and contained a glowing magic potion. If one looked closely, they would find that the part where the needle pierced into the brain, just like when old John used the hook of fate to remove distracting thoughts, had been blurred. And the magic potion in the spherical potion bottle was emptied one after another. Although he didn't know what kind of magic potion was in the potion bottle, based on the common sense of infusion, Dake knew that he needed to wake Sister Kalyan up. Dake Dimung. However, Sister Carrion had already appeared behind him without a sound. Dake was slightly startled. Sister Kalyan said, "You came just in time. Can you help me pour the new magic potion into those potion bottles?" Dake nodded and replied, "Of course, no problem." Sister Kalyan rubbed the corners of her eyes and took out 2 test tube racks from the medicine cabinet. Each test tube rack was filled with test tubes sealed with oak stoppers. The test tubes contained 2 different liquids. This pale yellow magic potion is Grimm's potion. It can effectively eliminate the side effects of soulless water and stabilize the adhesion between the soul and the body, making it less easy to be confused by psychic illusions. This golden yellow magic potion is Intuition's potion. It has a miraculous effect on curses. It can remove most curses involving the brain and mind manipulation. If taken in advance, it can also protect the brain from mind manipulation. Although they look similar, they are actually completely different magic potions. Follow me and don't mix them up. A total of 30 patients needed to be changed. 14 of them needed Grimm's potion, and 16 needed Intuition's potion. Although the remaining 19 people were also injected with soulless water, the situation wasn't serious. He only needed 2 to 3 days of rest to recover to his original state. In fact, the most troublesome ones were the 14 couples whose emotions and memories had been extracted. Grimm's potion could only stabilize their minds. They still needed more treatment to gradually recover their emotions and memories. According to Sister Kalyan, human emotions and memories were backed up in the brain, so it wasn't that easy to erase them. Anyway, it's good that they can recover. Dake quietly sighed in relief after he asked about the situation. Although he had his own considerations at the time, he didn't do anything when their emotions and memories were extracted. If they couldn't recover their emotions and memories, he would feel guilty. Sister Kalyan seemed to have seen through his thoughts and couldn't help but laugh. Dake Dimung, I heard about you when I was still working in the Saint. They all said that you were the incarnation of the devil, the disgrace of the Duke's family. Even though you were the son of the Valkyrie, you didn't inherit any martial virtues. I thought you were quite interesting at the time, but I didn't expect you to grow up to be such a boring person. Dake. Sister Kalyan casually poured Intuition potion into the last Marine Order member's spherical potion bottle and continued, between saving 10 people and saving 100 people, if there's someone important to you among the 10 people, and if there's someone you don't know among the 100 people, they're all innocent people. Who would you choose? Dake, 10 people. Sister Kalyan. Dake couldn't help but shake his head. Sister Kalyan, people's emotions and actions are separated. If I save 10 people and cause the 100 people to not be saved, I'll feel guilty, but I'll still save those 10 people next time. There's no conflict in this. Those 100 people didn't die because of me. My guilt is only because I don't have the ability to save 110 people at the same time. Sister Kalyan was stunned for a moment, then awkwardly scratched her messy silver hair. Okay, I was wrong. I still have Grimm's potion and Intuition's potion left. You can choose one as a reward. Intuition's potion. Dake didn't hesitate. Chapter 119. Green's potion and Intuition's potion. One targeted illusions while the other targeted brainwashing. The latter was obviously more useful. After this thing is made into a magic card, it should be an anti-curse card that specifically targets brainwashing cards like Taboo Love and Golden Treasure Chest. Dake finally got 3 tubes of Intuition's potion from Sister Kalyan. After thanking the nun, he exited the infirmary and bumped into Werther God, who was walking towards him. White was here to visit Luoboat. When the two met, White looked awkward, but he still forced himself to say, "Morning." "Morning." Dake nodded and walked past him. Dake, who had 3 tubes of Tushing's potion, couldn't just wander around. He quickly returned to the dorm and inserted the Tushing into the test tube rack. The 3 golden tubes of Tushing's potion glowed faintly, attracting his attention. Dake pondered for a moment, then took out the core materials from the masquerade ball and placed them on the table one by one. 1 second to memorize. https://m. Vipcanshu. VIP including Tushing's potion. There were 5 sets in total. Harpies feather, mermaid scale, ragdoll bear, zombies button, celestial beasts feather, and Tushing's potion. Apart from these, there's another material that can be harvested in the near future. Dake put the cat grass on his lap and looked expectantly at the budding flower on top of its head. It had been a month since he used the demon brain dropper for the first time. He could finally continue to absorb the sins. I haven't used it for a while. I wonder if it's rusty. Since pride and bliss have both exceeded 100 points, maybe it's necessary to try another method. Dake picked up the demon brain dropper, killed it, and then put it aside to dry. After a while, he suddenly narrowed his eyes and condensed his mental strength. At that moment, his mind was completely empty. There was nothing existed, except for a very small black dot in the middle. Just by focusing his attention on this black dot, his entire consciousness was rapidly converging toward it, highly condensing. Professor Kazair would never have thought of this. Dake was able to learn the basics of the underworld spirit art in such a short time. After entering the nether god state, Dake deliberately retracted bliss and released pride, according to the method of using emotions in the guide to using the magical brain dropper. Then he immediately picked up the demon brain dropper and pressed the sharp beak against his temple. He pinched the demon brain dropper with a little force before releasing it. An extremely thin black line was sucked out of his brain just like that. It was still 1 drop, but the density of this drop was obviously higher than before. Dake opened his eyes and exited the underworld god state. It was only after he had become a beginner that he realized that maintaining the god of the underworld state required continuous consumption of spiritual energy. Using this method to defend against the invasion of thoughts required an extremely high level of technique. However, now was not the time to study the nether spirit art. He dripped the drop of pride into the thinking bottle, carefully observing and sensing it. He seemed to have a natural instinct for great sins. After more than a month of observation and use, he was able to grasp the degree of the crime. The amount of this drop is at least 5 points of pride. It seems that this method is indeed feasible. Using the underworld spirit art to increase the concentration and output of emotions makes it easier to extract great sins. If I continue to use this method, the amount that can be extracted in a month can be increased from 10 points to 15 points. This was undoubtedly a very good result from the experiment. Next, Dake used the magical brain dropper again to extract 2/3 of the drop of pride from the thinking bottle and injected it into the branch of the worm tree. Then he carried the cat grass over. Meow meow meow. The cat grass was like a little monk that had finally smelled meat after a few months of fasting. With a meow, it pounced on it. Its 2 paws grabbed the branch and sucked it. Dake's face became round as he watched it suck with all its might. Soon, the cat grass transferred the pride that it had sucked into the flower bud on its head. The flower bud that had been stagnant for more than half a month finally began to grow. And from the beginning, the flower bloomed. As if it felt the itch on its head, the cat grass raised a paw and touched the side of the flower. It abandoned the branch that had been sucked dry and crawled to Dake's feet. Dake squatted down and picked it up, carefully observing the flowers blooming. This flower that had been cultivated with a total of 6 points of pride. From the dark gold at the bottom to the fiery red on the petals, the entire flower was filled with an extreme sense of luxury and nobility. However, Dake did not feel much of the opposite aura of light from it. If it wasn't for the experimental deduction, it would be hard for him to imagine that the basic refining method of bird and beast seeds, light attribute, was the correct way to refine this core material. If I use this flower of pride to refine, what kind of magic fairy would I be able to refine? Dake took out his notebook and drew the appearance of the flower of pride. Then he listed a few elements on the side. Cat pride sunlight plant. If it was just the first 3 elements, he actually had a guess. That was the sun god of the 12 Olympian gods in Digimon, Apollo. The Apollo was based on a lion. It was both a feline and the sun god. It had an almost ruthless self-esteem. Its pre-evolutionary form, growth stage suncrown beast, was a small lion cub. However, if it was only the first and the 4th elements, it would make people think of the pre-evolution, growth stage Diru beast. The result of the basic refining method itself is uncertain. Maybe both of these magic fairies are possible. The Apollo is a godlike digital beast that can control flames. If I want to increase the probability of refining an Apollo, I might need to add some fire attribute materials. On the other hand, if I want to refine a holy beast that is blessed by light, I should add some light attribute materials. Dake looked at the core material on the experiment table. Without a doubt, the fairy beast's feather will be a core element that will guide the refining result to the Diru beast. The flower of pride finally bloomed. However, Dake obviously wouldn't pick it immediately. He was more inclined to cultivate it into a fruit before using it. According to the current progress, I should be able to harvest the fruit tomorrow at this time. I need to make a decision before then. 1 o'clock. The school card vibrated at the same time. All the Shungmalian teachers and students received a notice. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, a teacher-student meeting would be held in the hall on the 1st floor. The principal had something to say. Chapter 120. It was just past 2:30. Students walked out of the 4 towers one after another. They still attached great importance to the first school assembly since the start of the school term. Especially since too many things happened last night that were difficult to analyze. They urgently needed the headmaster's explanation. When Dake opened the door and walked out, Deanna and Luosi were already waiting for him at the door. He smiled slightly and went to the castle with the 2 of them. As soon as they walked out of the tower, Deanna asked curiously, "Dake, do you know what the headmaster is going to say?" Dake shook his head. "I don't know." He really didn't know, but he had some guesses. According to the headmaster's behavior last night, he probably wouldn't attribute this incident to Professor Didi. First link. https://m. vipcanchu. VIP. After all, this incident involved too many students. If this incident was attributed to a professor, and someone else took it to the internet, Shungmalian Academy's position would become very awkward. In this relatively sensitive political period, Shungmalian Academy had to maintain its independence and not be pulled down by such a small matter. Therefore, Professor Didi could resign, but he couldn't resign because of the blame. The root of this matter could be traced back to the first student. It could also be attributed to the remnant thoughts of the moon goddess. But it couldn't be attributed to Professor Didi. From the standpoint of the academy protecting the students, the headmaster of ARDI probably wouldn't push that student out to take the blame. Then it could only be attributed to the remnant thoughts of the moon goddess. And because of religious reasons, the headmaster might even give the moon goddess another name. For example, God of the Evil Moon, Moon Disaster Beast, etc. In this way, Shungmalian Academy could be regarded as a pure victim and avoid criticism to the greatest extent. As for the names of the captured and brainwashed students, of course, they couldn't be exposed. They were actually all victims. Exposing their names would cause trouble for them. Generally speaking, this was Dake's guess based on the available information. But there was another problem. If the school really decided to do this, as one of the insiders, he should have received the headmaster's notice long ago. Therefore, Dake was still confused when he stepped into the hall. Like the other students, he was looking forward to Headmaster ARDI's explanation. Shungmalian students were always grouped according to their faculties. Dake sat down in the area marked Crown and whispered to Deanna and the others. The entire hall gradually became noisy as more and more students arrived. At 2:55 p.m., almost all the teachers and students had gathered in the hall. Professor Shi-Erfa stepped onto the stage and clapped his hands. Just this action, without any spell being cast, caused the audience to suddenly fall silent. It was as if Professor Shi-Erfu had muted them again. It was almost a conditioned reflex. Professor Shi-Erfu nodded with satisfaction before inviting Principal Aerti over. The principal, who was surrounded by the 9 elves, was as beautiful and noble as ever today. After she stepped onto the stage, she said a few words as an introduction before going straight to the point. Today, I want to announce something. Professor Didi Maxiwei resigned last night. There was no other embellishment. It was just a simple sentence. The students below the stage were in an uproar. Although Professor Didi's lectures were very boring and she often deducted points, as the headmaster of the House of Fools, she was indeed very kind outside of class. No one had ever seen her angry. Moreover, she was a professor of astronomy. It could be said that the more boring her history of magic was, the more interesting her astronomy was. The first-year students had only attended one astronomy class, so they didn't feel much about it. However, the upperclassmen were very fond of astronomy and even formed a club for it. For the upperclassmen, the existence of such a senior professor seemed to have become a habit. Professor Didi had indeed accompanied them throughout their entire student life. However, such a professor had left them without any warning. It was impossible to say that they weren't sad. But then Principal Aerti showed the students a completely different Professor Didi. Even Dake, who had heard about it from Professor Li, was quite surprised. What Principal Aerti slowly described was the Didi Maxiwei from her perspective. Willful, arrogant, unreasonable, stubborn. These were words that the students couldn't understand at all. However, they were an indispensable part of Professor Didi's personality. Principal Aerti had known Professor Didi for a long time. She described the Professor Didi in her mind without any concealment. From a fledgling little fairy, to a member of a 4-person adventure team, to being trapped in the ancient shrine and suffering from the aging curse. She didn't go into details about Professor Kazair, so she told the principal everything. She read the resignation letter in place of Professor Didi. She also told the principal about Professor Didi's inner torment in the past 10 years, and the details of what had happened recently. It was completely different from what Dake thought. Principal Aerti didn't make any edits at all. She only hid the students' names and told the principal everything. The students listened very carefully, even more so than when they were in class. Principal Aerti didn't show any favoritism. She gave the students the right to judge Professor Didi's behavior. It could be good or bad. It could be right or wrong. They could defend it from a subjective point of view. They could also criticize it from an objective point of view. They could do both. At last, Principal Aerti first invited one of the participants of this incident, White Gouda, to testify as the victim. White was obviously unprepared. He was dumbfounded when he was called up. For him, this was undoubtedly a public execution. He didn't know why Principal Aerti would do this. But under the encouragement of Principal Aerti's gaze, he still told the principal about how he was attacked last night and brought to the temple to be sacrificed. The hero's son's words were quite credible. No one really blamed a first-year student for not doing anything in this incident. They were just a little disappointed. But then, Principal Aerti invited another participant of this incident, Dake Dimung. Dake also didn't expect to be invited to the stage. However, under the gentle gaze of Principal Arte, he had no choice but to play along. He told Principal Arte everything that happened after he found the magic card that Victor had dropped and followed the traces into the secret room, including what he had seen and done. Of course, he skipped the details. The battle with the goddess ended with Professor Didi defeating the goddess and refining the goddess's tear. They were both the kingdom's son of twin swords. The performance of the Valkyrie's son and the hero's son formed an extremely sharp contrast. Chapter 121. The students' discussion grew louder and louder. It wasn't just the students. Even some of the professors looked at the two people on the stage with meaningful gazes. Some people were born with a meaning. When they enjoyed the benefits of this meaning, they also had to bear the corresponding vision and responsibility. The hero's son was like this. Actually, as the son of the Valkyrie, Dake Dimming was like this too. Otherwise, even with his past performance, he was just an ordinary playboy in the noble circle. Why would he be stigmatized to this extent? But today, young Thug was already on the road to getting rid of his stigma, and his performance was outstanding. The hero's son, who had more hopes placed on him, was still in the same place. This made it impossible for others to compare them. Their gazes were even more disappointed than before. They were like needles stabbing into White Gouda's body, piercing through his heart bit by bit. Remember the URL. Mvip, can't you? 6 White lowered his head. He didn't look below the stage. His hands and feet were clasped tightly together. He finally regretted it. It was true regret. It wasn't the kind of regret that lasted for 3 minutes, and then turned around to play another round. At this moment, his ears were filled with all kinds of noise. Some of the voices were getting louder and louder, and gradually stood out. Aima's voice, which he had gradually forgotten, was especially loud. Stop hanging out with Luoboat. Think about your parents who passed away. Think about your parents who passed away. White couldn't help but grab the pendant on his chest. Inside it was a picture of his mother. He glanced at Dake Dimming from the corner of his eye. He felt like he was standing beside the sun, scorched beyond recognition by the dazzling and blazing sunlight. But in reality, Dake wasn't happy about this. Obtaining the Crimson Star and winning a small championship weren't big or small things to him. They couldn't change anything. But the situation in front of him didn't give him a good feeling. If Principal Erdii cared about the hero's son's mentality, he shouldn't have let him and White go on stage at the same time and make 2 statements about who was better. It was almost imaginable. After today, discussions about the relationship between the 2 of them would definitely spread like wildfire. The big and small newspapers would crazily republish the actions of the 2 in this incident. Busybodies would definitely single them out for comparison and say some brainless things to make people laugh. As for himself, he would replace the hero's son and step onto the stage with the help of public opinion. This was completely contrary to his strategy of cultivating his body and mind. As long as there were brave people on the stage, it was fine. He didn't want to bask in this glory. As long as he didn't awaken the bloodline of the demon god. His status was high enough. The son of a duchess. The son of the Valkyrie. Just these 2 titles alone would allow him to smoothly reach the highest point in his life. He didn't need the title of hero at all. Are they trying to cover up the negative impact of Professor Didi? Or do you want to use this opportunity to take a political stand? Supporting me means supporting the Valkyrie, the Dove faction, and the first princess. Dake's mind raced. It was on a completely different level from what White had imagined. However, this was inevitable. After all, their mental ages were not on the same level. No matter what. This incident was a major event for Shungmalian Academy. On the surface, the school publicly explained the cause and effect of this incident, and even allowed 2 participants to testify. They basically nailed down the threat of this incident, and didn't allow anyone to stir up any waves. In addition, there were no casualties, which could be said to have minimized the negative impact. Although the negative impact still existed. However, the school was brave enough to take responsibility and didn't evade their image. Perhaps they would receive some praise. As for the hero's son and the Valkyrie's son, one was the victim and the other was the savior. However, they were both put on the stage for comparison, which would inevitably involve a large part of the public's attention. However, there were some things that perhaps the adults who didn't care about the children's nature didn't expect. At the end of the assembly, the principal of Erdii publicly announced that he would temporarily replace Professor Didi as the professor of the history of magic and astronomy until a new professor took office. This made more than 90% of the students who worshipped the principal very excited, and eased the atmosphere a little. When the principal of Erdii announced that the assembly was dismissed, the students' voices suddenly became louder, and then they all left the hall. Dake and White followed the principal of Erdii to an office under her instructions. Sit down, don't be too restrained. The principal of Erdii waved her hand, and a row of tea sets and snacks appeared on the table. Dake didn't intend to be restrained at all. Not only did he sit down, but he also skillfully washed the teacups, poured the black tea, and brought the first cup to White. "Ah, thank you." White hurriedly thanked him, but her face didn't look so good. Dake then poured a cup for himself and sat down, pursing his dry lips. The principal of Erdii sat down behind the desk, put the heavy burden on the table, and relaxed her shoulders. She slightly adjusted her expression and asked, "You too, what do you think of Professor Didi's behavior?" White, it's not very good." Dake, "It's not a good move." The principal of Erdii nodded slightly and didn't ask any more questions. She then turned and said, "White, you're second in the grade for this masquerade event. That's very good." White's face immediately turned red and she muttered, "It's not very good." The principal of Erdii then said to Dake, "Dake, if Yvette knew that you could perform like this, she would definitely hug me and cry." Dake blushed and said awkwardly, "Principal, you don't have to say this." The principal of Erdii said nostalgically, "Yvette has always been like this. Her heart is softer than anyone else's, but her appearance is stronger than anyone else's. No one is more reliable than her. Now it seems that like mother, like son." Dake was stunned. "Do I look like someone with a soft heart?" The principal of Erdii said, "And White, your father is the same. He was like a copy of you when he was a student. He's very active and can't calm down. He's very empathetic and is easily influenced by the people around him. He's often swayed because of this. But it's also because of this that he can become a hero, understand the suffering of the people, and fight for others." White was a little excited when she heard the word father. The principal of Erdii continued, "Your parents left some things in the academy when they were students. I didn't want to give them to you so early. But since you already know about the existence of the castle's secret passage, I'll give you these 2 treasure maps for now. But Dake, don't be lazy and ask Yvette. I know that she dotes on you a lot, and she definitely can't stand your coquetry." Dake immediately laughed dryly. The principal of Erdii flicked her fingertips, and a gust of wind blew, and the 2 treasure maps slowly floated down. Chapter 122. Although they were called treasure maps, they were actually just 2 hand-drawn drawings. The treasure map in Dake's hand was fine. At least it was made of parchment. The background and routes on the map were all drawn with a magic pen. It was quite delicate. However, he only glanced at the treasure map in White's hand and saw that it was a piece of homework paper. The paper was filled with scribbles. White was originally excited that she could get what her father left behind. But when she looked at it, she shyly moved the paper away and covered it with half of her body. Dark, on the other hand, didn't have such concerns. He started reading openly. The headmaster of Erdii didn't say which area the 2 treasure maps were pointing to, but it was obviously related to the secret passage. He also thought about it from the standpoint of the hero and the Valkyrie. These were probably left behind by their parents on a whim when they were students. They probably weren't left behind for their children. Maybe it was just a trend at the time. Not only the hero and the Valkyrie, but other students also left behind similar treasures. Dake carefully looked at the treasure map in his hand and found that it was a treasure map with a marker as the connection point. Remember, https://m, but can't you? VIP. The first marker was something that looked like a chess piece. Arvette's drawing skills were already quite good, but she used a Kumo style, which made Dark feel very troubled. After looking at it, he decided that if he couldn't find the so-called treasure before the end of the semester, he would go home and ask the Valkyrie. The headmaster of Erdii reminded them at the end, "The treasure exists and won't disappear for no reason. You have plenty of time to find it, so don't be too impatient. Especially White. Remember to focus on your studies." She didn't say anything else after that. She didn't mention politics, public opinion, or any other related topics. However, Dake could tell a lot from her attitude. She might use their identities to cause some trouble in the outside world, but she wouldn't bring those things to school. The castle of St. Marianne would be a wall, sheltered from the wind and the rain. If the students don't read the newspaper. White obviously didn't have that habit. Dake, on the other hand, never missed a single episode. After they left the office, Dake and White parted ways. even though the principal had given both of them a treasure map. However, regardless of whether it was the quality of the treasure map or their attitudes toward the treasure map, they were all different. Since his mother was still alive, Dake thought that this could be considered an extracurricular pastime. White, on the other hand, was more interested in the treasure map itself. According to the headmaster, it was a treasure left behind by his father, who was a hero. Regardless of whether it was the treasure map itself or the hidden treasures, they were all very memorable. If it weren't for the fact that Traveler's Street wasn't open for the time being, he might have found a frame to frame it. Treasure maps made from paper were too easily damaged. White carefully put away the treasure map and prepared to put it away in the dormitory. Originally, he wanted to go to the infirmary to pick up Luoboat, but now he changed his mind. The students who were injected with the lost soul water were able to leave the hospital. Luoboat stood at the door of the infirmary in a daze, sighing in his heart. My one-day holiday is gone just like that. The students who left the infirmary were all in pairs, and he was the only one who was alone. He thought of White's appearance when she was transformed, and thought that he must be careful not to mention that. He had experience, so he knew how difficult it was to talk about it. Oh, now he knew that White had transformed into a girl, but White didn't know that he had also transformed. This was an advantage. How wonderful. The couples who left the infirmary with Robert still didn't know that they had been eliminated, because their relationship wasn't real. That was why they had escaped death. If they were to find out, they wouldn't necessarily break up. After all, sometimes both men and women were well aware of it. In the infirmary, the members of the Maritime Order had also woken up one by one. Except for Mr. Haixing, who was the most seriously corrupted by the goddess's remnant thoughts, the rest of the people's brainwashing had been completely eliminated. Because Sister Kulyan had only separated them from the victims, they were able to see the full appearance of the members of the church for the first time, since they had removed the marine product skin. After confirming the other people's identities, everyone seemed very embarrassed. The memories of this period of time kept coming back, making them feel more and more ashamed. For example, Miss Haixin, when she thought of how she had captured her best friend and ex-boyfriend as sacrifices under the influence of evil thoughts, she couldn't help but laugh. If it wasn't for the goddess's influence, she certainly wouldn't have dared to do that, right? The unexpected feeling was quite good. Sikit also leaned on the hospital bed with a dazed expression. She felt that she had done a lot of things that she wanted to do before but didn't dare to do. Compared to before she was invited to join the order by Mr. Haixing, her whole body and mind were a lot more relaxed. It was just that the current situation was still unclear, and she didn't know what kind of punishment she would receive next. But as long as she wasn't expelled, it was fine. Why don't we? Other than Mr. Haixing, the rest of the members of the order suddenly came to a consensus after exchanging glances with each other. The goddess could fall. The order couldn't fall. In fact, the goddess's remnant thoughts only magnified their evil thoughts and hatred, causing their hearts to become distorted. It wasn't something that was created out of nothing. Without the influence of the goddess's remnant thoughts, their evil thoughts would be suppressed by their good thoughts. And on the surface, they would still be in order. In short, they would pay for what they had done, but it might not be too serious. Only Mr. Haixing, who had really planned all of this, would probably have to pay a bigger price. As for the final trial, it would have to wait for the 7 pairs of real victims to fully recover. Professor Didi, who had taken greater responsibility, and Professor Kazair, who had actually been negligent, would also be held accountable. It would take about 2 to 3 days. The school would report this matter to the court in its entirety. On the surface, they would be punished by the law. If no one took the opportunity to create trouble, this matter would soon pass. If this had happened during wartime, it would have been completely over with a sentence of, even the people didn't die. The legal system of the kingdom had not been perfected to that extent. A transcendental institution like the Shungmalian Academy was even beyond the jurisdiction of the kingdom's laws and regulations. In principle, it didn't even need to be reported. It could be completely handled internally. At the same time, Dake, who had already returned to the dormitory, was studying the treasure map in a more casual manner. Bang bang bang. He opened the door and saw that Deanna and Luosi were already fully armed. Deanna looked up at him and said excitedly, "Dake, let's explore the secret passage." Dake, huh? Ask for a monthly vote. I haven't asked for one in a long time. That activity seems to allow you to draw monthly votes. I just drew one and voted for myself. _degree. Angle_. Chapter 123. The headmaster of Erdii probably didn't expect this either. In front of all the teachers and students of the school, she openly and honestly told them all the details of the incident. And this was the result she got. During the assembly, the students might have felt sad about Professor Didi's resignation, and they might have condemned Professor Didi's dereliction of duty. But after the assembly, the matter was just that. For most of the students, it wasn't something they had personally experienced, so they just listened to it. Just like after they were disappointed with the brave son, no one would run to White and yell, "You don't deserve it," in front of her. At most, they would occasionally mention it and talk about it. It took time for public opinion to ferment, and it wasn't as straightforward as one would think. In the end, what really attracted their attention was the so-called secret passage that was inadvertently mentioned in the details of the incident. There was a secret passage in the castle. They had lived in the castle for so long, and explored so many times, but there was actually an unknown secret passage hidden in the castle. First website. https://m. VIP can't you? VIP. This was much more attractive than anything outside of her body. In a very short period of time, the whole Xingmalian was in an uproar. It just so happened that today was the Halloween holiday, and they had no place to vent their excess energy, so they had to find something to do. So the students rushed out and searched the ground excitedly, trying to find the secret passage that the headmaster had mentioned. At this time, the smart Deanna thought of Dake, who knew about the incident. When Dake returned to the dormitory, Deanna came to the door with Luosi, her eyes full of excitement. Dake didn't want to join in the fun, but he touched the parchment in his hand and decided to take a look. He was very interested in what his mother had hidden in the secret passage. On the other side, the men and women who had just come out of the infirmary suddenly found themselves in the limelight. Their classmates, whom they had never interacted with before, suddenly came out and asked about their well-being. It gave them goosebumps. Even Luoboat was stopped by his classmates on his way back to the dormitory. Those who didn't like him before were now eagerly attentive. Luoboat was a little touched at first, until they revealed their true intentions. "Enough. I'm really tired. Find someone else." Luoboat, who was struggling to break free from his classmates, rushed into the Knight Academy's tower, and met White, who was fully armed. White only noticed that the school was in an uproar over the secret passage when some of her classmates came knocking on her door. Originally, he had tried to make a copy of the map that his father had left behind in the dormitory, so that he wouldn't damage it. As a result, the map, which was originally like a scribble, had become unrecognizable after being drawn by him. He could only sigh happily. Perhaps this is hereditary. Then he gave up on copying. It wasn't until his classmates came knocking on his door that he suddenly realized that the secret passage had been leaked. The students would find the entrance sooner or later, and the treasure left behind by his father would never disappear, as Headmaster Erdii had said. Once other students found it. He had originally wanted to compete with Dake, but now he was even more impatient. "Luoboat, hurry, I'm running out of time." Before Luoboat could figure out what was going on, White pulled him and ran out of the Knight Academy's tower. There were actually many secret passages in the castle. White knew a lot about secret passages because of the mist figure he had obtained from Into the Abyss. But Dake only knew 2 of them. One of them was the secret passage near the statue of the Grand Magister. The other was the secret passage that White had passed through when he first followed him out. The one he was most familiar with was naturally the secret passage near the statue of the Grand Magister. It was almost 5 o'clock. Dake led Deanna and Luosi to the statue of the Grand Magister. He had passed by here several times, but he didn't pay much attention to the statue. But this time, the more he looked at it, the more familiar it was. He couldn't help but take out the treasure map to compare. "Dake, Is this the map of the secret passage? Deanna stood on tiptoe and asked. Dake shook his head slightly. This is the treasure map my mother drew when she was a student. Deanna suddenly became excited. Is there really a treasure map? Dake smiled. Since it's an adventure, how can there be no treasure map? Let's go. I seem to have found a clue. The first symbol of the treasure map, the chess piece, was undoubtedly in front of him. If Dake hadn't seen it with his own eyes, he would never have connected a chess piece with a statue. But now he was basically sure. As long as we find 2 more symbols, we can be sure of the map's direction. There are a total of 16 symbols on the map, and the treasure is the 17th. We're not in such a hurry. If we can find the second symbol tonight, we'll be very successful. Dake said as he carefully identified the route on the treasure map. What surprised him was that the line drawn from the first marker was not pointing to the entrance of the secret passage, but a straight line. A straight line? Dake thought for a while, and looked at the wall behind the Grand Magister with a strange look. It can't be right. Dake felt a little embarrassed when he thought about how he hid here before, and didn't find anything. He reached out and touched the wall, and with a little magic, ripples appeared on the wall like water. There was indeed a secret passage here. Dake took out his school card and subconsciously wanted to summon the little devil, but then his face stiffened and he put it away. I know, this is the entrance of the secret passage, right? Deanna quickly took out her school card and summoned her familiar. The little panda, which was only half a meter tall, appeared at her feet. Go. Deanna pointed forward, and the little panda crashed into the wall. After confirming that it was safe, the 3 of them entered one after another. Dake left marks on the wall as he said, There are 2 sides on the wall. There are torches on both sides of the tunnel. They will light up automatically when someone passes by. I've entered the secret passage 3 times, and although I haven't encountered any danger so far, I can't be sure that there's no danger in the passage. In fact, even if there's no danger before, there might be in the future. If my guess is correct, the environment of the secret passage is constantly changing. In the afternoon, you should have heard the principal say that last night's incident originated from a student who found the Temple of the Moon in the secret passage. But you definitely didn't realize it. In fact, before that student found the Temple of the Moon didn't exist. The problems involved here are very complicated. Deanna was still poking her head out in front of them. Dake couldn't help but say sternly, I'm saying all this to tell you, follow me and don't run around. Deanna and the little panda turned their heads at the same time, looking very wronged. Chapter 124. For the time being, there were no monsters or traps to be found. The most dangerous part of the secret passage was the complicated path. The path kept turning, the excessive number of crossroads, and the uneven surface of the road. Even someone with a strong sense of direction could not guarantee that they would not get lost. However, when Dake mentioned this, Deanna proudly took out a compass and said, Look, I came prepared. Then she immediately realized that the compass was just like her brain, spinning all the time. Haha, looks like it doesn't work. Deanna quietly put the compass back and took out a dozen glowing stickers. Dake's eyes lit up. He took the stickers from her hand and looked at them. This thing was much more reliable than a compass. As long as they wrote numbers on the stickers, drew an arrow, and stuck them on the wall along the way, it would greatly reduce the risk of getting lost. Deanna saw that her stickers were being used. Her big eyes suddenly narrowed into slits. Then she followed behind Dake, chewing on her milk candy and stickers, and began her first adventure as a student. Remember the URL. VIP, can't you? 6. It was probably the first time that so many people entered the secret passage in the Shungmalian castle at the same time. When the number of students in the secret passage exceeded 99%, the secret passage that had been silent for countless years finally had an unknown change. While the students were immersed in exploring the secret passage, the professors were worried sick. Principal Aerti and Professor Shi-Erfu had left the castle to minimize the impact of this incident. The professors below them were more or less unreliable. When Professor Thompson of Potionology was the first to discover that the students were exploring the secret passage, His face suddenly changed. He quickly gathered the rest of the professors. When all the professors were gathered, they found that the two professors with the highest positions were Professor Cheong-si from Muscle Brain and Professor Li from Seductress Brain. Professor Thompson's face suddenly fell and he fell on the sofa. What should I do? In the end, Professor Kazair said, from the perspective of the academy, we should not interfere with the students' independent exploration. However, the dangers of the secret passage are unpredictable. We need to be prepared in advance, especially if a large number of students get lost inside. Professor Li sat in the air with his legs crossed. He immediately patted his chest and said, "Leave the situation of getting lost to me. This is easy to solve." Now that the biggest problem had been solved, the professors felt a lot more relaxed. Professor Thompson's expression softened. Unlike the underground city, the secret passageway does not have corresponding security measures. I still think we should seal it off, Professor Cheong-si said. This goes against the school's principles. We can wait for the principal to come back before making a decision. Professor Thompson lowered his voice and said, but before that, we can think of other ways. Professor Cheong-si asked curiously, what is it? Professor Thompson's voice was gloomy. Increase the homework. The students, who were still immersed in the exploration of the secret passage, did not realize the consequences of their actions. Probably because there were more and more people entering the secret passage, not many people cared if they got lost or not. They shouted adventure. But in reality, they did not take it seriously. The higher the grade, the more so. Adventure in the underground city was good enough. A secret passage that did not even have magical creatures. Just think of it as an autumn outing. Anyway, people who had the gourmet series of magic cards were very popular. Even Dake Dimming became less cautious after encountering a few passers-by. In addition, Deanna's fully armed brought a lot of snacks, so they gradually became part of the outing team. But don't say that. With this change in mindset, the secret passage, which had been repetitive, became interesting. Dake gradually realized that there were a lot of talents among the students. Someone actually set up a road sign at the fork in the road, and each road sign was marked with a number. Dake directly drew a map according to the road signs, and actually drew quite a few of them. At about 7 o'clock, he finally found the second marker on the treasure map. It was a lampstand mixed in with the usual torches. The base of the lampstand was an elephant's trunk. The Valkyrie had actually drawn a small elephant in the treasure map. It's only 7 o'clock now. Looks like there's still a chance to find another marker. Dake was a little happy as he continued his search. Deanna and Luosi, who finally found something in the secret passage, were excited as if they had found the treasure. They were even happier than Dake himself. They went deeper. Dake happened to meet the Brave Sons duo. He found that White was holding the piece of paper and running a little hurriedly. He did not know if she had found anything. Anyway, both of their treasure maps were not the same, so Dake did not pay much attention to it. On the way back, he saw AI Ma Métis standing alone in a secret passage, holding a notebook and quickly drawing a mural on the wall. Dake saw the stickers on the wall and suddenly realized that he had been here before. At that time, he did not see any mural. Is this a new mural? Dake had an idea. After whispering a few words to Deanna and Luosi, he also took out his notebook and quickly drew a mural. AI Ma looked at him and said seriously, I found it first. Dake nodded quickly. Well, if we find the same result, I'll write your name as the first one. Okay. AI Ma continued to observe and draw the mural. Deanna leaned against the wall and cracked sunflower seeds with chocolate shells. She looked at Dake and AI Ma, who were getting more and more focused. She whispered to Luosi, they are so serious. Luosi was a little hesitant. Should we learn from them? Deanna was perplexed. Well, even if they draw it, I can't understand it. Luosi was silent. She could not understand it either. But then she said, we can look around and see if there are similar murals in the secret passage nearby. Deanna's eyes lit up. That's right, we can help Dake. She was immediately energized. Luosi could not help but shake her head and smile. She looked at Dake and AI Ma with a hint of envy. They are so alike. The secret passageway was indeed changing silently, especially as more and more students began to explore the secret passageway as if it were a maze. Some undesirable changes began to take place. A new secret passage appeared in the secret passage. Mechanical doors leading to other passages appeared on the wall. A tunnel leading to the lower level appeared under their feet. A minotaur with a bull's head and a human's body stepped out of the wall with a battle-axe in its hand. Its eyes shone with a trace of blood. Luoboat Broheim screamed when he saw the minotaur that looked like White's minotaur being born. The secret passage was alive. Chapter 125. Luoboat. White Gouda heard the scream and immediately rushed over. He pulled out Troll at an extremely fast speed. In just a few seconds of normal summoning, the 4-meter-tall troll fell to the ground in a flash of light. The troll, which was as long as his knees, rose up and blocked the battle axe that came crashing down. Luoboat, who was blocked by the monster, almost peed his pants. His legs trembled and he froze on the spot. Victor hurriedly grabbed him by the arm and ran back. Moo. The minotaur, which was even bigger than the monster, suddenly took a deep breath and roared. Its arm muscles bulged as it exerted force from its back and chopped down the axe. Poochie. The monster's magic power spurted out like blood. The axe went down from its left shoulder and chopped off its entire left arm. White and Luoboat didn't dare to look back. The monster kept screaming. It was no match for the minotaur. After a while, White felt the troll card in his hand tremble slightly. Dots of starlight gathered and formed the image of the monster again. Remember, https://m.vip VIP. However, at this moment, this magic elf card had already lost its luster and would require a very long time to recover. White knew something was wrong. He couldn't help but pinch the taboo love card in his hand. He tried it secretly after entering the secret tunnel. The effect of taboo love was still there. The little person in the mist could also respond to his call and even guide him. But he had just suffered a loss and didn't dare to follow the little person's guidance. But now, facing the terrifying minotaur, he could only rely on that taboo love card that had betrayed him. This made him feel very weak. 9:30 am. Dake was a step behind, but he finished the mural faster than AI Ma. He had long realized that he had a talent for drawing. With his smooth fingers, he copied quickly and accurately. After finishing, he began to carefully observe the mural from beginning to end. The whole mural depicted a very ancient story. It felt like an Egyptian mural painting style. In the first painting, poor people in ragged clothes were digging out carts of or from a mine. In the second painting, a half-naked blacksmith was forging ores into standard square bricks. In the third painting, a merchant in plain clothes was selling baskets of square bricks to the nobles. In the fourth painting, luxuriously dressed nobles used square bricks to build a tower on top of an altar. In the fifth painting, thousands of humans were praying for the arrival of a certain existence under the altar. In the sixth painting, a shining giant beast emerged from a black hole in the sky. In the seventh painting, a ferocious and greedy beast roared and devoured all the sacrifices and humans. In the eighth painting, human blood and corpses formed a strange pattern on the ground. There were 8 paintings in total. Dark mainly put in the greatest effort on the 8th painting, but in the end, he was able to copy it in a more detailed way. He always felt that what this painting was trying to express was particularly strange and had research value. In a situation where he could not confirm whether the murals would disappear or not, copying them was the best way. Dake, Deanna, who had been wandering around after finding no new murals, suddenly ran back. Dake turned his head with some confusion. Deanna panted and said, "Did you hear the sound of a cow? A very, very fierce one?" Dake wanted to say that he did not hear it, but then he heard the sound of a cow. Moo. That sound was not only fierce, it was super fierce. Dake subconsciously took out his school card, and then realized that the sound was still some distance away. Did someone release a magical elf? Could it be that this secret passage gave birth to a magical creature? Both thoughts flashed through his mind. Dake immediately put his notebook into his shoulder bag, then glanced at AI Ma, who was still drawing, and reminded her, "Time to go." Aima only glanced at him quickly, then continued to draw, but her speed was obviously faster. Dake was about to say something when he suddenly noticed that the leftmost mural had begun to fade. He thought of something and immediately said, "I can't finish it, I'll lend it to you when we get back." But when he said that, Aima clenched her teeth and focused even more. Moo. The sound suddenly became closer. Dake's face changed slightly, and he immediately grabbed Aima's shoulder and said in a deep voice, "It might be a magical creature, don't be stubborn." Aima's body stiffened. This time she quickly put away her pen and put it in her bag. Dake was slightly relieved and immediately said loudly, Go to a place with a lot of people as soon as possible, and find a senior." Deanna and Luosi were very obedient at this time, and the four of them quickly left the passage, the murals behind them disappearing at a speed visible to the naked eye. But just as the four of them turned a corner, they suddenly heard the sound of footsteps and panting coming from the other side of the wall. Dake listened carefully, and soon heard Luoboat scream and White's angry roar, as well as the sound of something heavy hitting the ground. He immediately realized that the Minotaur, which he didn't know whether it was a magical fairy or a magical creature, was chasing White and Luoboat. Dake's face couldn't help but show a conflicted expression. He had just experienced the danger of the goddess, and he really didn't want to put himself in danger again. But White and Luoboat were in the same grade after all. Just as he was feeling conflicted, Aima also recognized the voices of the two people, and couldn't help but exclaim, "It's White and Luoboat." Then Luoboat's surprised voice came from next door. "It's Aima." "We're saved." But almost a second later, White's voice overpowered Luoboat's cry. "Don't come over, Aima. Run." But it was this cry of run that made Aima make up her mind. She looked left and right, and immediately rushed to the fork in the road next door. But someone was faster than her. Dake lowered his head and ran, his lips moving quickly. The moment he passed Aima, the beautiful fallen angel appeared in the light, and ran side by side with him. "Demoness beast, please." "No problem." The black cloth floating on the demoness' left shoulder laughed like an evil spirit. The tattered cloak fluttered like a pair of wings. The giant claws on her left hand were sharp and fierce. A dark aura leaked out silently. It was hard to imagine that this was a powerful creature that could be summoned in just a few seconds. Aima's expression froze, and she subconsciously stopped in her tracks. Deanna and Luosi passed by her and chased after Dake without hesitation. The newborn king of the labyrinth would never have imagined that he would attract the fallen angel's punishment just by chasing two little mice. Dake Dimming turned at the fork in the road, and as soon as he opened his eyes, he saw the Minotaurus with his battle axe raised high. Dark wave. The demoness suddenly raised her arms and made a big heart in front of her chest. The dark power condensed rapidly, turning into countless bat-like dark matter that was released. Amidst White and Luoboat screams, the dark bats swarmed over their heads and pounced on the Minotaurus face. The ferocious Minotaur let out a blood-curdling scream, and under the control of his chaotic brain he waved his battle axe crazily. The demoness tapped her toes and flew up. The demonic claw on her left hand shrank and transformed into a dark spear, piercing through the gap between the battle axe. In the blink of an eye, the demoness appeared behind the Minotaurus and knelt on one knee. The spear in her left hand turned back into a claw, and the cloak behind her fell quietly. Boom. A bloody hole with a diameter of 2 meters appeared in the Minotaurus' chest and abdomen. Its movements suddenly stopped, and its eyes lost their light. Then it fell to the ground on its back. White and Luoboat stared in disbelief at the Minotaurus that had been killed in an instant. Their breaths that were in their throats suddenly relaxed. Luoboat suddenly lay on the ground, sweating profusely. White was also swaying. "Are you okay?" Dake asked casually as he walked past them. However, their brains were already overloaded, and they could only stare blankly without replying. Dake did not mind, and walked straight to the Minotaurus corpse. It didn't turn into light. Could it be a real demon? The Minotaurus corpse lay quietly on the ground, and the giant battle axe fell beside it. This king of the labyrinth was much weaker than he had imagined. It was all bark and no bite. At the thought of how cautious he had been just now, Dake could not help but feel helpless. In front of him, the demoness returned to his side. She leaned over and whispered in his ear, "Master, I'm about to pass out. If you want to delete the post that you mistakenly posted, you can write it clearly on the post. I'll delete it if I see it." Chapter 126. Dake's expression froze, and it took him a long time to react. He silently stored the demoness beast into the card before continuing to examine the Minotaur's corpse. It wasn't that he couldn't expose the demoness beast, but he didn't want too many people to know that the demoness beast had evolved from his familiar. Although the familiar was also a type of magical fairy, it was extremely special. In theory, it didn't have any offensive capabilities. If he wanted to give the familiar the ability to attack, he had to use a magical card called the Spell Cage. The Spell Cage could temporarily seal the familiar, the golem, and other simulated life forms into the card and use it as a magical fairy card. The Minotaur's corpse didn't stay there as Dake had thought. After about 3 minutes, it gradually disappeared, just like the previous murals. However, unlike the murals that disappeared without a trace, the Minotaur left behind an extremely thick cow's hair. He didn't know where it came from. Dake picked up the cow's hair with 2 fingers and looked at it carefully. He was speechless. Website: https://m. Vipcanchu. VIP. However, having such a hair was better than having nothing. He quickly accepted the fact and carefully put away the cow's hair. He then turned around and walked toward the others. White and Luo Boat had already recovered. Aima leaned against the wall and flipped through her notes. Diana and Rose were giggling, but no one knew what they were talking about. Dake walked over and said, "Let's go back. We still have classes tomorrow." Everyone walked toward the entrance of the secret passage. Halfway there, a palm-sized little fairy came through the wall and found them. This little fairy looked exactly like Professor Li. It flew around them twice and began to lead the way. Diana chased after the little fairy, like a kitten chasing after a dragonfly. Dake and the others couldn't help but quicken their pace. They quickly exited the secret passage. There were already many people outside the secret passage on their way back to the dormitory. The fairies, who had brought them out of the secret tunnel, were crowded in midair. Their wings were flapping quickly, making noises. A single little fairy looked especially cute, but when hundreds of them crowded together, it only made people feel terrified. Well, should I say that this is indeed the work of Professor Li? Dake felt like his scalp was about to explode. When he finally got back to the dormitory, he quickly said goodnight to Diana and Luo Si. Then he locked the door, brushed his teeth, fed the cat, watered the tree, and went to bed in one go. The holiday was finally over. But tonight was destined to be a sleepless night. The next morning at 6:30 a.m., Dake sat in the common room and looked at the little fiend that was flying back with a basket. He felt that his life was finally back on track. Ooh, in the end, this was the life he wanted. The ball, the moon goddess, and the secret passage could all go to hell. Dake felt a little satisfied in his life. First, he took out his breakfast from the basket and put it on the table. Then he took out today's Great Sage Daily. He took a sip of milk, opened the newspaper, and casually glanced at it. Uffed. He almost spat out the milk. He looked at the headline of the newspaper and instantly felt uncomfortable. Shocking. The Duke's mansion and the royal family are connected by marriage. The Duke's son and the royal princess are dating on Halloween. Below the headline was a picture of Dake dancing with someone. In the picture, Dake was wearing a Prince of Darkness suit and a black crow mask. He looked mysterious and handsome. His dance partner was wearing the same suit. The so-called little princess. Only her back could be seen. But wasn't this Diana? Was it because the picture of her dancing with the bear was not attractive enough, so the newspaper used this picture as a replacement? But what about your integrity as a journalist? Dake was really speechless. He continued to read and found that the newspaper did not mention anything about the moon goddess. He didn't know if the article was not finished yet, or if it was suppressed by someone else. Or maybe they were waiting for a big move. Why didn't I realize that the Great Sage Daily was such a sensationalist newspaper? Maybe I should consider a new one. Dake sighed, but he still read the entire article while eating. The Great Sage Daily was the most widely circulated newspaper in the kingdom. Most of the time, it did not represent the newspaper's own voice. Regardless of whether it was true or not, today's headline obviously had an ulterior motive. Are they trying to tie the forces behind the second princess to the first princess? But if this report was led by the Dove faction, wouldn't it be unnecessary? It can't be a purely entertainment report, right? After a few guesses, Dake put down the newspaper, closed his eyes, and began to prepare for class. The first class after Halloween was arithmetic. Professor Lily wrote a question on the blackboard. How many fairies did I release last night to catch you? There was a deathly silence. No one could answer this sharp question that clearly lacked the necessary conditions. Then, Professor Lily wrote a second question on the blackboard. How many people were late this morning? One of the students braved universal condemnation and raised his hand. Ai ma Métis, you answer. 8 people were late, Professor. Very good. Métis gets 5 points. Everyone who was late will have 5 points deducted. Go stand at the back of the classroom as punishment. Thus, 3 people from the noble house and 5 from the night house, a total of 8 students stood in a row at the back of the classroom with their heads down. Dake, who was sitting in the last row, only had to turn his head slightly to see their embarrassment and frustration. Since the start of school, there had been a lot of people who were late to class. However, this was the first time that 8 people were late at the same time. Professor Lily probably did not expect the students to be so lazy during the 2-day holiday. Among the 8 people, Doran from the noble house suddenly raised his hand. Professor Lily squinted his eyes. Doran, what do you want to say? Doran, who was late for the first time in his life, suddenly gritted his teeth and said, Professor, I was not late on purpose. Professor Lily, no one is late on purpose. Doran, this I am different. It's because I felt too tired when I woke up in the morning that I felt weak all over. Professor Lily, okay Doran, I already know that you were late because you slept in, so shut your mouth. The classroom was filled with laughter. Doran immediately shut up. The rest of the latecomers were also ashamed, and did not dare to say more. No one noticed that some of them had 2 faint marks on the back of their necks that were about to disappear. In short, after the class, they received double the homework. The second class was still Professor Ka Zair's introduction to magic. In the 3rd month of the first year, Professor Ka Zair finally began to teach about the production of magic cards. He did not look very good, but he still said tirelessly, Today we will begin to teach one of the methods of making magic cards, how to imprint magic spells on the cards. Heartsuit, thank you for your tickets and subscriptions. Heartsuit. Chapter 127. With the rapid development of magical technology, the magic of the old era has been gradually abandoned. But this doesn't mean that we will no longer use magic. Professor Ka Zair flicked his finger, and a wisp of flame appeared on his fingertip. The flame grew with the wind and turned into a magic wand. With a slight shake, it turned into a thin card. He blew on it again and extinguished it. It was so cool that it made people's hair stand on end. Learning magic is very difficult and tedious. Most mages can only learn how to cast a fireball in their lifetime. We usually call them magic apprentices, but magic apprentices were very precious in the previous generation. Chanting spells and drawing magic power is only one part of casting spells. If you want to really cast a fireball, you must know how the fireball is created, why it can burn, what the medium is, the relationship between magic power and the flame, the law of the flame's temperature change, how long it can last. Professor Ka Zair explained in detail. Remember the website, MVIP, can't you? V so detailed that the little mages' heads were about to explode. Dake saw that Deanna was already holding her head on the table, and there were probably small circles in her eyes. After a few minutes, Professor Ka Zair gently ended the topic about the old era's magic. But with the development of magical technology, we solved this problem. As long as we use the magic language to write the corresponding magic incantation, and then brand the magic incantation on the card to create a complete magic card, we can activate it through simple summoning spells and release magic. Of course, the magical language is a course that you can only learn in second grade. The magical language varies from person to person, and there are many factors involved. The same fireball spell written by different mages will end up with different spells. But there are also some special spells that are universal. Before we learn the magical language, we can try to create simple magic cards by copying this universal magic spell. Now open the last appendix of the textbook. The students followed Professor Zayer's instructions and turned to the last appendix of the textbook. Appendix 1. Universal spells: magic bullet spell, push spell, obstacle spell, fade spell, flicker spell. There were a total of 5 universal spells recorded in the appendix of Basic Theory of Magic 1. This was what first-year students needed to learn. Magic bullet spell, push spell. Dake looked at the appendix in surprise. These 5 universal curses were different from what he had imagined for beginners. Under normal circumstances, shouldn't it be Fireball 1, Fireball 2, Fireball 3, or something like that? It seemed that most of the students had the same idea as him. The students flipped through the catalog and couldn't help but whisper to each other. Professor Zayer looked at the students whispering. Not only was he not angry, but he even smiled. He reached out and pressed down, saying, "Although these 5 universal curses seem basic, they are important curses that can be used throughout the life of an archmage. As time passes, you will naturally discover their importance. In today's lesson, we will only talk about the principles and not do any experiments. The official experiment would be conducted next Monday. From this month onwards, the professors will no longer provide materials for experiments. You will need to find the materials on your own and use your credits to buy them." Compared to the confusion caused by the universal curses, Professor Zayer's last sentence clearly had a greater impact on the students. After a short moment of silence, the classroom suddenly became noisy. A girl immediately raised her hand. "Professor, what if I don't have enough credits to buy the materials?" Professor Zayer kindly said, "The professors will estimate your current credits when they give you homework. As long as you listen carefully and complete your homework on time, there won't be a problem of not having enough credits." Another student keenly read the meaning behind Professor Zayer's words and said in shock, "Professor, from today onwards, there will be more experimental homework?" Professor Zayer nodded. "Actually, there has already been. The creation of the fantasy beast belongs to this category." Then a few more students raised their hands and asked questions. Professor Zayer answered them all one by one. After all the questions were asked, the little mages finally lost all hope. It seemed that from today onwards, not only could they not eat and wait for death, but they also had to learn to be careful. Ai Ma, who was sitting in the first row, had a calm face. White, who was sitting in the last row, excitedly high-fived Luo Boat. Dake, who was sitting by the window, looked at Deanna's pitiful eyes and said heartlessly, "Solve it yourself." Deanna could only count on her fingers how much she had to save. Luosi was secretly laughing on the side. In fact, they had all received a lot of credits from the masquerade party. As long as they didn't squander them, they were still financially comfortable. In the following class, Professor Zayer carefully explained the principles and methods of imprinting curses on the magic cards. But the students were no longer in the mood to listen to the lecture. They were just numbly taking notes. Other than reminding the students not to forget to buy materials on the weekend, Professor Zayer didn't add any more homework. Ring, ring, ring. The bell rang for the end of class. When the professor left the classroom, the students' emotions instantly exploded. The classroom was filled with all kinds of wailing sounds. Many people had been looking forward to the history of magic class in the afternoon, but now they were all in no mood. Dake smiled, packed up his things, and prepared to leave the classroom. But just as he was about to get up, Ai Ma appeared in front of him. Ai Ma grabbed the notebook and whispered, "You said you would let me copy it." Dake suddenly remembered what happened last night and said, "Tonight I'll bring it to the library." "Okay." Ai Ma responded softly and quickly left. Deanna glanced at Ai Ma and whispered in Luosi's ear, "Let's go to the library tonight." Luosi nodded, just in time to finish the homework given by Professor Li Li. After leaving the classroom, Dake didn't go to the cafeteria. He knocked on the door and entered Professor Kazainer's office. "Professor, are you free?" The professor nodded slightly and pointed at the sofa. Dake sat on the sofa and skillfully made tea. Professor Kazair sighed and suddenly said, "Dimming, I'm really sorry." Dake was stunned, then smiled. "Professor, the one you need to apologize to is not me." Professor Kazainer's face showed a trace of sadness. "I've been feeling guilty for all these years. If I had been more determined to stop them from entering the temple of the ancient god, everything wouldn't have turned out like this. When I learned that Didi's goal was to create the tear of the goddess, I couldn't bear to stop her. Fortunately, you were there." Dake said helplessly, "I'm not talking about her." Professor Kazair nodded. "I know." "Dake, let's change the topic. Professor, I want to know what's so special about the location of the castle, and what's the historical image?" Chapter 128. Faced with Dake's sudden question, Professor Kazair frowned and said, "This isn't something you should know." Dake thought he had found the key, so he immediately said, "Professor, I don't want to go too deep. Let me think about it." He leaned back in his chair and tapped the table with the knuckle of his middle finger. As the hands on the dial turned, the atmosphere in the office became more and more stagnant. Professor Kazair finally said, "Since you're curious, you can always find relevant documents. But I have to remind you that you know how to avoid danger, but other students might not, so you better keep what I'm about to say to you." Dake pursed his lips and smiled. "Professor, I know, I'm a tight-lipped person." Professor Kazair ignored his words and continued, "I can't tell you much, just the answers to these two questions." Dake immediately perked up and listened carefully. "Professor Kazair, the Shungmalian castle doesn't exist anywhere on the continent." Dake, "Isn't it in the north of the kingdom?" Professor Kazair shook his head and said, "Of course not. The Shungmalian castle you see outside is just a projection of the castle. The castle doesn't exist on the kingdom's territory, so it's not under the kingdom's jurisdiction." Dake never thought he would get this answer. He was so surprised that he forgot to drink his tea. "Professor Kazair, you should know that the auditorium and the arena are not in the same dimension. The audience that comes from all over the kingdom doesn't actually enter the academy. The same goes for Traveler's Street. The stone block in the pavilion in the middle of the lake is one of the switches." Dark said in surprise, "Then where is the real location of the castle?" Professor Kazair, "On the axis of time and space." Dake was confused. "Where is it?" Professor Kazair, "It's a field that we can't touch with our knowledge. All we need to know is that the construction of the castle can be traced back to the old days, and all the history after its construction will be recorded in the castle. As for the authenticity of the image, it depends on the thickness of history." That was all that Professor Kazair had said, but it led to more room for imagination. When Dake left the office, he finally understood what Professor Didi meant by copying history. For eras ago, the legendary alchemist Martin sacrificed 576 for 801 people to create a single tear of the moon goddess. Professor Didi borrowed the castle's mechanism and cleverly used the image of that period of history to infinitely reduce the scale of the sacrifice and finally obtain the same experimental results. This was despite the fact that the amount of knowledge involved was something that ordinary people would never be able to attain in their lifetime. But that was the general meaning. In other words, be it the moon temple, the statue of the goddess, the mural and the minotaur from last night, they are all projections of history. Dake's mind was in turmoil. He had never had such a strong desire for knowledge about something. He had to use God's underworld to empty his mind, follow the track of history and see the truth in the fog. No wonder this era is named after the Shungmalian. This is indeed the holy land of the world. Whether it's Merlin, Dalton, or Da Vinci, most of the great magisters who laid the foundation of magic came from the Shungmalian. After Dake ate a quick lunch, he went to the library and spent a long time looking for some books about time and space. However, he knew all the words in the book, but when he connected them together, he didn't understand anything. This caused the temperature of his brain to drop rapidly, returning to normal. In the end, he borrowed a book called Merlin's Biography, the greatest magister in history. Perhaps this book would become his daily pastime book for a long time in the future. 5 minutes less than 2 o'clock. All the students in the 4 branches of the first grade were already seated in the classroom. This was not a common sight for the students who would procrastinate if they could. However, since Principal Arte was the substitute teacher for this class, it was only natural that she would be absent. The principal didn't have much time. Before the new history of magic professor arrived, the first grade students would most likely have to be taught in the same classroom. The students in the 4 branches were divided into 4 groups. Dake flipped through the textbook, but his thoughts were not on the class that was about to begin. He only came back to his senses when Principal Erdii entered the classroom. Principal Erdii was still calm today. It seemed like the matter of the moon goddess was handled properly. Regardless, the history of magic class finally started. Unlike Professor Didi, Principal Erdii didn't follow the book. She didn't even use a textbook. Instead, she used her personal experience to describe the hardships and twists and turns of the demon race. Before the hero, the Valkyrie, and many other outstanding figures who ended the demon race's era grew up, the Shungmalian, as the last fortress of hope for mankind, was spied on and invaded by the demon race more than once. In order to protect the next generation from the demon race, our professors sacrificed no less than the heroes. But times of peace always make people forget the sacrifices of the past and the cruelty of war. People also don't remember that it wasn't God who cared for us in the darkness. The history of magic is the history of magic and magic. It is also the history of the heroes who wrote the epic. Today, I'm going to talk about the history of the heroes. Let's start with the hero. The hero Brett God. No one would not be interested in the hero who saved the world. People could always find their favorite hero among the many heroes. Although Brett the hero was promoted as a model hero, he was actually just one of many heroes. But today's topic was still the hero. As the son of the hero, White was obviously very excited. The students also looked at him a lot more kindly. But it was different from what the students expected. What Principal Erdii talked about was Brett the hero's mischievous student days. No one is perfect from birth. She probably wanted to instill this idea in the students. But the students didn't seem to get it very well. The classroom was gradually filled with a cheerful atmosphere. White lowered his head deeply. Even so, Brett still revealed his potential as a hero in the story. Although White's face was red, he still listened very carefully. Principal Erdii occasionally mentioned the Valkyrie who was in the same grade as the hero. Dake listened the most at that time. According to Principal Erdii's description, no one would have thought a little girl who liked knitting and cats would eventually become an unshakable spiritual leader on the battlefield. You're tuning in to the Earbook Haven YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.